17 October 1944, Aachen. Veteran American troops advancing on the ancient city of Charlemagne have encountered a new military force unique to the Third Reich. They are the Volkssturm, or People's Storm. Home militia units made up of men who are too young, old, or physically unfit for frontline service. Even members of the Hitler Youth are encouraged to take part under the supervision of local party officials. Decreed by the Führer in September and implemented by the Reichscommissioner for Total War Commitment, Joseph Goebbels, the creation of the Volkssturm coincided with a complete manpower mobilization in Germany. Now, as its skilled workers march off to war, the Reich must rely more on slave labor from countries like Poland, France, and Holland to keep its factories running. Along with the new manpower mandates have come belt-tightening decrees. The flamboyant Goebbels has increased the German work week to 60 hours and closed all theaters and most restaurants. The organizer and political leader of the Volkssturm is Martin Bormann, the degenerate, colorless, and heavy-set former elementary school teacher and cellmate to Hitler, who is now the Führer's private secretary. But command of the Home Defense Force is the responsibility of the bespectacled and girlish Heinrich Himmler, a former Bavarian chicken farmer and now commander-in-chief of the replacement army. The struggle between the two men for control of the Home Army is part and parcel of the larger struggle between the Nazi Party and the Army Reserve for control of Germany's home front. Himmler has ordered the new conscripts be trained by the infamous stormtroopers of the Sturmabteilung, or SA, and the National Socialist Motor Corps. For the most part, what is available to them is from stocks of older arms captured in enemy countries, and some of the more modern Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Each man also is given identification papers and brassards with the illustrious title Deutscher Volkssturm Wehrmacht. Armed with this, and what little training they can be afforded, the men march into combat to fight alongside their army counterparts. Now, as the combat-hardened troops of Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges' First Army approach Aachen, they are expecting to be resisted by trained German troops. They are astonished to be met by what seems like a foolish attempt at defense by old men and boys. The Americans at first cannot bring themselves to fire on them, especially the children and teenagers of the Hitler Youth. They learn quickly that not only are the youths of the Volkssturm capable of great acts of gallantry, but in many cases their fanaticism rivals that of the most hardened SS troopers. Hodges orders Major General Leland S. Hobbs' 30th Division, the Old Hickory Division, to attack the city from the north. From the south, Major General Clarence R. Hubner's experienced 1st Division, the Big Red One, moves into position to complete the American pincers movement. While Aachen is no Munich or Nuremberg, it is an ancient city rich in history and symbolism. It is the first major German fortress to face destruction at the hands of Allied armies, and Hodges knows its capture will be a terrible psychological blow to the Reich. The commander of the German garrison at Aachen knows it too. He has at his disposal about 12,000 men of the Volkssturm and associated army units. Additionally, unbeknownst to the Americans, he has received word from General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt that the 1st SS Panzer Corps and its 2 divisions, the 116th Panzer and 3rd Panzer Grenadier, another 22,500 men, are on their way to help turn back the Yanks. But the help is slow in coming, and the assault on the city already has begun, and it is up to the Volkssturm to hold it for now. In the north, the Old Hickory Division suddenly finds the going difficult. At first, they had advanced quickly, but stiff German resistance closer to the town results in 2,000 U.S. casualties. Hobbs puts in a call for support, and the Allied Supreme Command sends him a handful of medium tanks from the Big Red One's bridgehead at the west wall. Armor makes the difference, and the assault pushes forward. Despite heavy casualties, they finally are able to link up with the 1st Division and complete the encirclement of Aachen. The battle immediately becomes house to house. At every entrance, a duel of hand grenades and heavy doses of machine gun fire. Slowly, the German defenders are either flushed out or killed. The Americans even have to contend with literally clearing out the sewers. Overlooked manholes become death traps when men bypass them in their zeal to advance. German soldiers and Volkssturm literally pop up and shoot the Americans in the back. Hand-to-hand combat is the norm for the gallant GIs, and soon the dead lay piled uncovered in the streets. The evacuation of the American wounded becomes another headache for Hübner. Glass and rubble litter Aachen's streets, making it impossible for jeeps and trucks to carry out the casualties. This is soon overcome when someone suggests the use of M29 Weasel tracked vehicles to carry out the incapacitated men. The commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, unable to break through to the city and seeing that the capture of Aachen is imminent, chooses to pull his 2 divisions out of the line on 19 October. Unaware of this, and still intent on holding the historic stronghold of German princes, the defenders of Aachen hold out for 2 more days. In the end, the Americans bombard the city with the new 155mm artillery pieces, and German morale flags. By nightfall on 21 October, the garrison's remaining 1,600 men surrender after sending captured Americans to plead for mercy. Perhaps their capitulation will come as a disappointment to the Führer. He may not believe the citizen army of Aachen has given alles für Deutschland, but they have given enough. The combat-weary Americans of the 1st Division, who now occupy the city, refer to their new home, with good reason, as Bloody Aachen. October 1944, lady, General Douglas MacArthur doesn't make promises lightly. After 2.5 long years, he has finally made his way back to the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to the Filipino people that he would return. For more than 2 years, MacArthur has been working out in intricate detail his attack against the Japanese in the Philippines. He proposed taking disparate parts of ground, naval, and air force and orchestrating them in a series of jabs and jumps that would bypass, outflank, and overrun the Japanese. Some call his plan brilliant. The president supports it. Others, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, debate its merit. As late as the middle of September, they still were unconvinced of Leyte's strategic importance. On 16 October, Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet went into action, clearing the area around Leyte. Land-based aircraft of the 13th and 5th Air Forces attacked targets to the south on Mindanao, while Naval Task Group 77.4 moved against Cebu, Mindanao, and Leyte itself. On 17 October, Task Group 38.4 of Halsey's 3rd Fleet lent its support to the fray, focusing its attention on Luzon. Imperial forces suffered heavy losses, while U.S. losses were at a minimum. As MacArthur's invasion force, one of the largest ever assembled, neared Leyte Gulf on 18 October, the channel was already clear of mines and the surrounding small islands secured. The Japanese Air Force was crippled and lying low, and the Japanese Navy, the rising sun's only real hope of repelling a U.S. attack, was rebuilding, but not yet ready to engage. The attack begins as battleships of Vice Admiral Theodore Wilkinson's Southern Attack Force bombard the beaches of Leyte near the town of Dulag, destroying Japanese ammunition and supply dumps. 15 miles away, Rear Admiral Daniel Barbie's Northern Attack Force launches an assault near Tacloban. Right on schedule, the first wave of the invasion, 4 divisions of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army, lands against sporadic resistance from the Japanese. Although General Tomoyoku Yamashita has 200,000 troops in the Philippines, only 16,000 of them are on Leyte. MacArthur, on the other hand, has brought with him more than 193,000 Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Despite the odds against them, the Japanese do not go gentle into the Pacific night. On orange and blue beaches, the 96th Division meets heavy enemy artillery and mortar fire, but the Americans give as good as they get. Only the intense heat and swampy ground seem able to slow their progress, and they soon report the capture of the Japanese gun positions. Elsewhere, however, progress is held up by dug-in Japanese troops determined to drive the invaders into the sea. At Violet Beach, the Americans assigned to capture the airfield west of Dulag are badly bloodied by enemy artillery. In addition to heavy casualties, they lose 60% of their armor. At 1 p.m., with the fighting just barely underway and Red Beach still replete with enemy snipers, MacArthur can wait no longer. He wades ashore to survey the battlefield. Tacloban airfield is falling to the Americans. Japanese troops retreat inland to await reinforcements, but the beachheads remain unlinked. MacArthur takes a break from his survey to pen a note to President Roosevelt, the first from the freed Philippines, to reiterate the importance of this action in Leyte. The successful capture of Leyte, he once again explains, will cut the Japanese forces in two, both strategically as well as tactically. Strategically, it will sever the enemy's defensive line, which extends along the coast of Asia from the Japanese homeland to the tip of Singapore. Tactically, it will divide Japanese forces in the Philippines in two. As night falls, MacArthur rallies his people. This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. Don't tell Douglas MacArthur that you can't go home again. He has. October 1944, the Pacific. In the 2 years since its catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway, Japan's military fortunes have declined in the face of growing American military and industrial might. Commander of the Imperial Navy, Admiral Suemo Toyota, realizing that his outer defense ring has been irreversibly penetrated, carefully husbands the remnants of his naval strength in anticipation of the moment it will be committed wholesale to the defense of the home islands against the U.S. fleet. However, with the strategic initiative having passed to the Americans, any Japanese plan will be reactive. For Operation Shogo, they are forced to define, assess, and prioritize their empire based upon areas that cannot be allowed to fall. The sites chosen as decisive theaters of battle are the Philippines, Formosa, the Kurils, and the home island of Honshu. These four areas represent the wagers on which Japan will bet its remaining strength with one last throw of the dice. Show 1, the code indicating engagement in the Philippines, is relayed from the Army and Navy commands on the afternoon of 17 October. MacArthur has landed at Leyte, and there are no more tomorrows for which to save the fleet. Toyota's plan is, on the face of it, simple. What remains of the Imperial Japanese Navy is divided into four main forces. The Northern Force, under the command of Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa and containing Japan's last four carriers, approaches the Philippines from the northeast, while Center Force, Southern Force 1 and Southern Force 2 sailed from the west to execute a pincer assault on the Americans in Leyte Gulf. Toyota knows that Admiral Bull Halsey, commander of the powerful U.S. Third Fleet, has dreamed of engaging the Japanese in a grand and decisive carrier conflict since his first glimpse of the shattered U.S. warships at Pearl Harbor. Halsey's mission at Leyte is to provide cover for MacArthur's landing force, but with the last four carriers in the Japanese Navy offered up as bait, it may be possible to lure him away from his post, leaving Leyte to be guarded by Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet. The 7th is charged with providing bomber support to ground troops and is ill-equipped to fight a major sea engagement. While Ozawa lures Halsey north, the Japanese pincer is to close on the Leyte beachhead. The northern half of the pincer is Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, which is to close on the 7th Fleet through the San Bernardino Strait. The two southern striking forces, under the command of Admirals Shogi Mishimura and Kiyohide Shima, are to rendezvous in the Mindanao Sea and sail through the Surigao Strait into Leyte Gulf. Without their naval guardians, the American ground troops in the Philippines will be stranded. The combined power of Japanese air, sea, and land forces will be free to smash the beachheads, bringing to a crushing end MacArthur's brief moment of glory. Just north of Palawan Island on 23 October, two patrolling American submarines, the Dace and Darter, come to periscope depth to investigate sonar readings of intense surface activity. To their surprise, they find themselves amidst Kurita's northern striking force. Now the battle begins in earnest. Halsey orders Task Force 38 to strike Kurita in the constricted waters of the Sibuyan Sea. Over the next 3.5 hours, American planes fly 260 sorties against center force. Their primary target is the super battleship Musashi, with its 400mm sheath of armor plating. Predictably, the planes at first seem to inflict little damage. Finally, the cumulative effect of 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes deals Musashi a mortal blow. By dusk, she heels over and founders. Admiral Kurita's staff now advises him that to proceed eastward is merely to offer up the remainder of the fleet as meat for the enemy. At first, Kurita is inclined to agree and orders a general retirement westward. However, by 4 p.m., with no further U.S. airstrikes forthcoming, Kurita believes that the bait of Ozawa's fainting force has finally succeeded in luring Halsey north. Gambling on just that, Kurita orders a course reversal. If Ozawa's feint has worked, Kurita's nighttime dash through the San Bernardino Strait will meet with little or no opposition. Halsey's last report on Kurita's force at 4:40 p.m. has that arm of the Japanese fleet in full retreat westward. At the same time, he receives the news from his scouting planes that he has been waiting for. The Japanese carriers are 190 miles west of Luzon's Cape Engano. Listening in on Halsey's signal traffic, both Nimitz and Kincaid wrongly assume that Halsey is leaving behind a blocking force to guard the straits. But as night falls, the side door to Leyte's beaches is left wide open. Kincaid, believing his northern flank is still screened, now springs a night ambush that decimates Nishimura's southern force. Placing his ships in a semicircle at the mouth of the Surigao Strait, Kincaid succeeds in executing the dream maneuver of every fighting ship commander. By capping the strait with his ships, Kincaid crosses the T of the enemy and unloads all his guns on the trapped Japanese. Kincaid has won a stunning victory. At the cost of 39 killed and 114 wounded, his 7th Fleet has sunk 17 of the 19 ships that sailed into the trap. There is no time for congratulations. Kincaid now receives shocking news from Task Group 77.4's commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, that he is engaging a large Japanese force. Sprague's group consists of only 6 escort carriers and 20 destroyers. Despite the odds, Sprague makes the courageous decision to throw his outgunned force against Kurita, hoping their sacrifice will buy time for the troop transports under his protection to get away or for help to arrive. Sprague's bomb-laden planes harry the Japanese to keep Kurita off balance long enough for destroyers to launch their torpedo attacks. Braving the geysers of water thrown up around them by the heavy shells from the Rising Sun cruisers, the tin cans press their attack. To the northeast, Admiral Halsey, realizing that his force cannot reach Leyte in time to be of help there, launches strikes against Ozawa's fainting force. Ozawa's flagship, the Zuikaku, the sole surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, is ablaze and badly listing. By the time he transfers his flag, his fleet is scattered, his battle lost. Ozawa can only hope that the sacrifice was not in vain. Back at Leyte, Sprague's battle is far from over. His remaining destroyers now launch near-suicidal attacks. 3 destroyers are sunk, but their sacrifice is rewarded. Kurita signals his battered ships to disengage and follow him north. As Halsey prepares to finish off Ozawa's force, he receives a communique from Nimitz at Pearl Harbor demanding to know the whereabouts of the task group that is supposed to be guarding the San Bernardino Strait. The implied criticism stings Halsey. After some deliberation, he turns his force around and heads for Leyte, leaving behind Admiral Mark Mitcher with a 3-carrier task group to pursue Ozawa. While Halsey is making for Leyte Gulf, Mitcher all but annihilates Ozawa's northern force. Arriving at Leyte, Halsey finds the greatest naval battle in history is over, and he has only deep regrets to show for it. The results of the Battle of Leyte Gulf speak for themselves. Of the 32 ships lost, 26 were Japanese. As an effective fighting force, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer exists. First November 1944, Walcheren Island, situated at the northern tip of the Scheldt River estuary. This is not a particularly imposing geographic entity. Just 18 miles across, this saucer-shaped isle has only 3 towns. Right now, however, Walcheren looms impossibly large in the eyes of the British and American armed forces. Having devoted many months and many lives to the taking of the port city of Antwerp, the Allies find themselves yet unable to make strategic use of it. That will remain the case until the small island is captured and rid of its quite formidable residents, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and the Wehrmacht's 70th Infantry Division. The Allied Expeditionary Force in Northern Europe continues to be plagued by supply problems. Commanders thought the taking of Antwerp would provide an immediate solution. But with significant forces dug in on Walcheren, the Germans still control access to the port, if not the port itself. Responsibility for the liberation of Walcheren is that of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, but Monty, still stinging from the debacle at Arnhem, has been in the eyes of many dragging his feet. He finally assigns the task to Lieutenant General Henry Crehar's 1st Canadian Army. The final plan to take the island is called Operation Infatuate. The Canadians, having failed on the night of 31 October to seize the island along a narrow causeway leading to the mainland, now plan a final 3-pronged effort to eliminate the stubborn German defenders. Along with another attack across the causeway, 2 amphibious landings will be made at Flushing and Westkapelle. A series of strategic bombing raids have destroyed outlying dikes and flooded Walcheren's lowlands, confining the Germans to the high ground. They are, however, no less well defended. Lying inland, unbeknownst to the assault force, is a deadly array of 18 major gun batteries in reinforced concrete strongpoints disguised as farmhouses. Log bunkers housing machine guns cover every exit from the beaches. Additionally, underwater obstacles with explosives designed to gut landing craft make the approaches dangerous. Even if a beachhead can be won, numerous and well-placed minefields will make advancing inland hazardous. Need now drives the Allied command, and the need of the moment is to open Antwerp harbor. The British commandos assigned to attack Flushing strike out at dawn across the Scheldt estuary and enter the town with little trouble. But the infantry that follows is forced to endure brutal and costly street battles before the town is finally liberated. The attack against the causeway again runs into trouble. The narrowness of the approach exposes the attackers to withering small arms fire from the defenders. But after a tough day of fighting, the Germans finally are forced to withdraw. Once the causeway itself is secured, Canadian forces surge onto the island and establish a bridgehead. They hold it tenaciously as the inevitable German counterattacks come. Pinned down, they cannot advance. At Westkapelle, a bombardment by battleship HMS Warspite and 2 monitors is of little help to the invading force. The blistering naval artillery fire fails to knock out pillboxes and gun emplacements. The commandos are forced to land in full daylight and without air cover. A murderous curtain of enemy fire wipes out more than 50 men. Even the armor providing support takes a tremendous beating. Landing craft are blown to bits by shore batteries, and troops are viciously mowed down as they wade ashore. For a time, the very fate of the operation hangs in the balance. But with the timely arrival of RAF Typhoons, the attack picks up momentum. Assault forces push into the town despite heavy fire and severe losses. The Royal Engineers finally manage to drive ashore the remaining modified armor and establish a tentative beachhead. The battle rages for 40 hours, with every inch of ground bitterly contested. Slowly but surely, the Canadians rout the defenders from their positions and claim the town. With the footholds affected, it is only a matter of time before the Germans surrender. The flooding of the island lowlands, which heretofore has been an inconvenience to the Germans, now acts against the attackers, limiting the paths by which troops and artillery can approach the town of Middelburg, where the German defense is now concentrated. General Wilhelm Dasser finally admits defeat and surrenders his command in the early hours of 7 November. Small as the operation has been, it is still a minor epic of gallantry for the forces involved. Even with superiority in troops and material, it has taken Montgomery 3 weeks of hard fighting to clear the Scheldt and claim Walcheren. Some 13,000 Allied casualties, including 6,000 Canadians, offer mute testimony to the cost of the operation. Now, all that remains is to sweep the channel to open the way for the flow of much-needed supplies into Antwerp. Early November 1944, Leyte. Despite the near-total destruction of the Imperial Navy off the Philippine coast, the Japanese High Command orders 14th Army Commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita to decide the fate of the Philippine campaign at Leyte instead of Luzon. Yamashita deploys his 35th Army to defend the island. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur, having made good on his promise to return to the Philippines, prepares for the breakout phase of his campaign to win back the islands. MacArthur's troops have captured all 5 airfields in the area, and it now falls to his air commander, Lieutenant General George Kenney, to ensure that they are up and running in the shortest possible time. The task facing Kenney's engineers is indeed formidable. Trying to provide a hard surface for the runways, they lay down tons of steel matting, only to see it devoured by the swampy terrain. With the water table only 18 inches below the surface, their efforts resemble what one engineer called a thin slice of coral or metal laid upon a jello mold. But engagement of the enemy is imminent, and MacArthur needs his land-based air force operational now. 6th Army Commander General Walter Kruger informs the engineers at one such airstrip that unless they start laying gravel, they will be digging foxholes for their lives within 24 hours. The airstrips are quickly made serviceable. Meanwhile, a storm at sea batters the American fleet and keeps it from providing the long-range air support vitally needed by the GIs on Leyte. Some in the Japanese High Command are reminded of the original kamikaze, the so-called Divine Wind Typhoon that saved the home island from attack centuries ago. They see the appearance of this storm as an omen that the American invasion will likewise be repelled. With air support drawn from every corner of the Philippines, the Japanese planners begin to move the vitally needed reinforcements to Leyte. By 11 December, Yamashita has brought the original garrison of 15,000 men up to a combat strength of 45,000 well-supplied and motivated troops. but not without grievous cost. Although it established local air superiority to the degree that it is bombing MacArthur's field headquarters daily, Japanese air power suffers from too many missions and too accurate anti-aircraft fire from American gunners. Their loss rate of 100 planes a week cannot long be sustained. Additionally, Kenny's 5th Air Force, dicey airstrips notwithstanding, has pounded Yamashita's meager complement of naval transports and escorts mercilessly. For the price of landing 2 divisions, the Japanese have lost 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers, 6 escort craft, and 17 transport craft. Finally, realizing that they are up against 2 American corps and that the defenses of Luzon are being severely weakened, the High Command decides to cease supply operations to Leyte. Once again, like many smaller island garrisons before them, the Japanese force is abandoned, left with only 2 options: victory or death. November 1944, Lorraine. Although the bulk of the Allies' efforts are directed toward clearing the desperately needed channel ports, Third Army, under its flamboyant commander, General George Patton, has its eyes fixed toward one objective: the German frontier. Although Third Army has had bridgeheads across the Moselle since September, the German army still continues to defend as far forward as possible, slowing Patton's advance. During this time, Third Army has even weathered a counterattack by the reconstituted 5th Panzer Army. But that was before Patton's fuel ration was diverted to support Field Marshal Montgomery's Market Garden operation in Holland. Stripped of its mobility, Third Army has been forced to lay siege to the fortress city of Metz and attempt to reduce it by storm. However, even with the battle for Metz still raging, Patton is making plans for the resumption of Third Army's drive on the Rhine. On paper, the disparity between Patton's forces and the Germans is overwhelming. Numbering well over 250,000 men and enjoying complete air superiority, the Third Army's morale is high. Opposing them is the German First Army, barely 86,000 troops of questionable morale, some in ad hoc formations. What's more important, these formations are spread over a 75-mile front with only 2nd Panzer Division's 67 tanks in reserve. Patton has only to repeat his winning strategy of massing his forces at breakthrough points to accomplish his goal of reaching the Rhine. It is late in the campaigning season, and the unremitting rains of October have continued on into November. Now, what Napoleon called the 5th element of war, mud, turns every unpaved surface into a morass. The weather prompts Major Generals Robert Grow and Mantonetti, commanders of the 6th Armored Division and 12th Corps respectively, to visit Patton on the eve of the attack. Both generals plead for a postponement. Patton hears them out and then asks, "Would either of you care to make a recommendation as to your successor?" After showing them battle maps and explaining what they are to do, Patton dismisses the 2 re-motivated commanders to carry out his orders. Later, the general remarks that he has always believed there are more tired divisional commanders than there are tired divisions. With geographic and climatic realities taking a back seat to his desire to breach the German frontier, Patton launches his attack on time. In a downpour and supported by 22,000 artillery rounds, Eddy's 12th Corps infantry divisions all gain their objectives on a 30-mile front. But the going has been arduous. Even when the opportunity came to deploy his armor, the combination of mud and enemy minefields reduced their advances to a crawl. While 12th Corps is attacking across the Moselle, Major General Walton Walker's 20th Corps attempts to envelop Metz. But Walker's opponent, SS General Hermann Priess, is a clever tactician. He foils Walker's attempts for more than a week before 20th Corps finally succeeds in breaking into the suburbs around Metz. The grim, bloody task of house-to-house fighting begins. The vigor and dash that has up to now been the hallmark of Third Army in general, and Patton in particular, has suffered from the enforced stagnation placed on it. And now its dynamic commander is unwilling to alter his tactics to accommodate military and climatic realities. The Lorraine phase of Patton's drive becomes its low point. By spreading his troops across a broad front, Patton plays directly to the German defenders' paltry strength. By ordering piecemeal attacks instead of massing his forces for breakthrough punches against an enemy with no appreciable reserves, Patton cost Third Army dearly in blood. November 1944, Tromsøfjord, Norway. The introduction and successful use of the new Tallboy bomb has brought British ingenuity back to the forefront of the war. Sir Barnes Wallis, chief engineer for the British Vickers Aircraft Company and designer of the Wellington bomber, created the RAF's newest weapon. Wallis already is known to many as the inventor of the famous bouncing bombs, which were dropped by British Lancaster bombers in a daring raid on Germany's Ruhr River dams. The Tallboy is 6 tons of massive destruction. Manufactured in southern England, this awesome weapon drops to the earth faster than the speed of sound, in part because its specially designed fins make it spin, stabilizing it like a gyroscope. When this monster strikes the target, it explodes with a force capable of cracking open even the sturdiest of concrete-reinforced bunkers or underground installations. The Tallboy was first used against a railway tunnel in France during the Normandy campaign, where it held up the advance of an entire panzer division on its way to the front. Now, the Tallboy has claimed its greatest victim, the dreaded German warship Tirpitz. For much of the war, the mere mention of the name Tirpitz has struck fear into the hearts of the Allied Admiralty. This 45,000-ton steel monster was launched in April 1939 and commissioned in 1941. She was capable of 31 knots, had an 8,000-mile cruising range, carried 8 15-inch guns, and was home to 2,500 German sailors. The Tirpitz's very existence has influenced the balance of sea power in the war. Often, it took no more than an intelligence report of her sailing to cause the British naval commanders to reroute whole convoys. Protected by weather, fate, and when lying in harbor by smoke clouds produced by special generators, the Tirpitz has played cat and mouse with the RAF. Until now, that is. In October, 21 Lancaster bombers equipped with Tallboy bombs flew over 1,200 miles to catch the giant lady sleeping unprepared at her new anchorage in Norway. 2 near misses and 1 direct hit shook the mighty juggernaut. Within an instant, the 6-ton bombs had done their job. A 100-foot gash was ripped in Tirpitz's hull. As water poured into the listing ship, fire reached her magazines, and she exploded in a whirlwind of flame and death. More than 1,000 of her crew went down with her, and only debris and smoke were left to mark her passing. Tirpitz, mightiest of battleships, is gone. Thanks to Barnes' Tallboy bomb, British sailors can sleep a little safer in their bunks. November 1944, Hyde Park. After several months of intense and sometimes bitter campaigning for re-election, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt receives word while relaxing at home that his efforts have paid off. The American people have returned him to the Oval Office for an unprecedented 4th term. Roosevelt candidly told Democratic leaders in July that he was not interested in seeking re-election. Nevertheless, he accepted the bid of his party, conceding, "If the people command me to continue in this office and in this war, I have as little right to withdraw as a soldier has to leave his post in the line." Running against New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, FDR wins, if not hands down, at least decisively, with over 53% of the popular vote and 432 electoral votes. Dewey receives 46% and 99 electoral votes. Not surprisingly, a large number of the absentee ballots cast by the boys in uniform go to their commander-in-chief. The president and his running mate, Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, ran on a platform of winning the war and building a prosperous post-war economy. Roosevelt, who is physically and mentally tired after leading the United States through domestic and global turmoil for the last 12 years, also has one important item on his agenda that he'd like to see come to fruition. He is as wed to the idea of forming a United Nations organization to secure world peace as Woodrow Wilson was to forming the League of Nations after the Great War. FDR knew that re-election was the only way to ensure that his post-war dream would become a reality. Republican challenger Dewey, an efficient, hard-working, and honest man, fought corruption in New York as district attorney before becoming governor, but he offered Americans little in the way of change. Dewey condemned what he called the administration's inefficiency, waste, excessive centralization, and destruction of private enterprise. At the same time, however, he vowed to strengthen Roosevelt's labor, Social Security, and agricultural programs. All things considered, Dewey really never had a chance. The Allies are pushing their way across Europe, and General Douglas MacArthur has just made good on his promise to return to the Philippines. A president as charismatic as Roosevelt, leading his nation to ultimate victory over the forces of evil, could not easily be defeated. The American people came to this dance with Roosevelt. Now it appears they plan to leave with him when it's over. Still, speculation about the president's health persists. In pictures, he appears pallid, his eyes dark, sunken, but FDR's personal physician vows that the president is perfectly okay. The good doctor further suggests that any stories to the contrary are purely political, designed only to cast doubt on Roosevelt's ability to serve another 4 years. Roosevelt's demonstrated stamina speaks for itself. It would have been almost inconceivable for a man who wasn't in excellent health to conduct a campaign as physically demanding as his. November 1944, Belgium. The first 3 Allied ships have arrived at the newly opened port of Antwerp. Since 4 September, when the British 11th Armored Division first entered this strategically important city, Allied combat and engineering units have worked round the clock to secure and clear its environs, and to rebuild and reopen its massive seaport. It has taken the combined efforts of American and British port construction units to undo the damage done by Allied artillery in the liberation of Antwerp, and by the Nazis themselves as they retreated. As reclamation work began, bewildered engineers discovered the Germans had dumped tons of concrete debris into quaysides and berths, and removed more than 35 miles of railway track and 200 railway crossings. In a matter of weeks, however, as Allied troops cleared the Scheldt River estuary and captured Walcheren Island at the head of the channel, the engineering units cleared 219 of the port's 242 berths, restored its 600 cranes, and repaired all of its key bridges. Clearing the channel for sea traffic was somewhat more difficult. The British Admiralty deployed 2 minesweeping details to the task. The retreating Germans had left 3 types of mines in Antwerp harbor. Moored mines explode against a ship's hull on contact. Ground mines lie on the bottom and explode when they come into contact with a ship's magnetic field, or, in the case of the acoustic type, when they detect noise from its propellers. The Royal Navy devised a number of solutions to the problem, including the Oropesa minesweeper, patterned after the trawling devices of commercial fishermen. These incredibly simple devices cut the cables of moored mines from below, allowing them to float to the surface, where they are detonated harmlessly. To dispatch ground mines, the ingenious British drag electrical cables through the water, activating the magnetic firing mechanisms. And acoustic mines are exploded, from a safe distance by minesweeping boats using electronic hammers to send vibrations through the water. If these measures fail, the engineers achieve the same effect by simply tossing hand grenades into the water. Between 4 November and 26 November, the British minesweepers swept or detonated 229 bottom mines and 38 moored mines, and the channel was declared safe for operations. Though the channel has been opened to traffic, the port itself remains vulnerable to German attacks. Insidious V-weapons rain down from the sky. More than 300 V-1s and V-2s have pummeled the port and city with devastating force, leaving 3,000 dead and 12,000 wounded, mostly civilians. To combat the buzz bombs, British and American forces array more than 300 heavy anti-aircraft guns around the city, providing civilian and military personnel in the area at least a small measure of security. In the interest of streamlining harbor operations, Ike opts against a joint command structure and hands control of the new Allied port to the British. No one on the American side is complaining. Now that the Allies control Antwerp, troops at the Western Front will begin receiving fresh supplies almost immediately, and the drive to Berlin can begin anew. November 1944, the Philippines. Fighting continues on the island of Leyte more than a month after U.S. troops first arrived on the beaches near Tacloban and Dulag. It has been tough going for American ground forces. They face ever-increasing resistance from an ever-growing Japanese presence on the island. No one, including General Tomoyuki Yamashita, head of Philippine Defense, really understands why Imperial General Headquarters has decided to make a stand on Leyte. A U.S. invasion of Luzon is inevitable, but rather than concentrate forces there, Field Marshal Hisaishi Terauchi, Supreme Commander of the Japanese Southern Army, has stripped Luzon of its defenses in order to fight a futile battle on the southern island. When the Allies arrived on Leyte, only 16,000 enemy troops occupied the island. Now, though a rout of the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Leyte Gulf has given the U.S. at least theoretical control of the surrounding waters, the Emperor's army has managed to increase its strength here to 55,000 men. Many of the Japanese reinforcements have come ashore at the naturally protected Ormoc Bay on Leyte's southwestern coast, a point of entry the U.S. wants to close. Once on the island, the enemy has dug in well. U.S. troops paid a heavy price in casualties before finally breaking the defenses at Breakneck Ridge, near the northern coastal town of Carigara. Now, both sides are bogged down in heavy fighting near the inland towns of Burauen and Buri. U.S. forces moving toward the port town of Ormoc from the north and from the south around Beibei have had their progress stalled by the Japanese as well. The Imperial Command has its sights set on recapturing vital airfields from the Americans. Its troops almost succeed at Burauen Field with a force of 40 aircraft and 250 paratroopers. While the U.S. ground operations on Leyte sputter, its offensives on the seas have been more productive. Admiral Slew McCain's Task Group 38.1 continues carrier strikes against Luzon, targeting shipping and the capital city of Manila. The Flat Tops have sunk 3 cruisers and several other vessels, while the Hellcats and Avengers, launched from their decks, have caught many Japanese aircraft on the ground and destroyed them before they ever had a chance to fight. But the Third Fleet is paying a price for its success. Crews work in a constant state of unease, knowing that at any moment, Japanese kamikaze pilots on a one-way trip to glory for the Emperor may come streaking out of the sky toward their ship. But they are taking an even greater psychological toll, which is beginning to have a devastating effect on the fighting effectiveness of the men. The menace from these fanatical suicide bombers is so great that the Navy has a plan on the drawing board to throw a blanket on the problem. A big blue blanket. Once implemented, this plan will provide stepped-up fighter protection of the U.S. fleet, increased fighter patrols of Japanese airfields that pose a kamikaze threat, and a watchful radar eye to warn the fleet of coming attack. Their ferocious stand on Leyte notwithstanding, it now seems only a matter of time before the Japanese forces in the Philippines run out of weapons to throw at the determined and ingenious Yanks. November 1944, Pacific Theater. As the war rages across the vast expanse of the Pacific and Allied forces draw nearer to the Japanese home islands, the number of combat sorties by Army Air Corps and Navy pilots has increased. So has the number of pilots shot down. Many of these pilots, like Lieutenant J.G. George Bush, the Navy's youngest commissioned pilot, have been saved from certain death by a U.S. submarine popping to the surface and plucking them from the water. Because it is of necessity shrouded in secrecy, the submarine service is known as the Silent Service. Like the crews of surface-going vessels, the 81 officers and enlisted men who occupy each of the new Steel Sharks put to sea for months at a time, but they do so in vessels that are only 311 feet long and 27 feet wide. And they ply their deadly, dangerous trade at depths of 300 to 400 feet below the surface of the ocean. Quarters aboard ship are so cramped, the torpedo men have been known to sleep atop their deadly cargo. In this small space, a unique camaraderie develops among the men. The formal relationship between enlisted men and their officers that is dictated by regulations fades away. Perhaps the names by which the men refer to their boats best illustrate the submariner's outlook and lifestyle. The most common are pig boats and steel coffins. Beautiful as they are deadly, the thin-hulled subs are also fragile. They can be torn apart by the concussions of depth charges, the trash can explosives launched from Japanese destroyers. To drop the charges close enough to a sub to damage or destroy it, however, the destroyer has to close within range of the sub's 10 torpedo tubes. But the submarine is only as dangerous as its torpedoes, and the American Mark 14 torpedo has left American subcommanders at a decided disadvantage. Plagued by development problems from the start, it was rushed into production with predictable results. Its most dangerous shortcoming is that it is steam-driven, so it leaves a telltale trail of bubbles which gives away the submarine's position. Its Japanese counterpart, the Type 95 long-lance torpedo, is electric and leaves no such trail. In addition to its propulsion problems, the Mark 14 also suffered from a faulty detonation device. After 2 years of complaints from subcommanders, including a report from one skipper that he had fired 13 torpedoes into the hull of a Japanese freighter and only one had detonated, the Navy finally produced a new and improved electric torpedo, the Mark 18. Beside technical difficulties, another major obstacle subs have faced is that the American High Command has been slow to incorporate them into their strategic planning. Since the beginning of the war, subs have been used in myriad roles, none of which were intended by their designers. In addition to standing lifeguard duty for downed pilots, subs routinely have been employed to ferry supplies to besieged garrisons and transport raiding parties to distant enemy outposts. But now that American submarines are arriving on station at the rate of 4 a month, the new commander of the submarine service, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, is seeing to it that they are finally being used as their designers intended, to hunt and sink Japanese merchant vessels. This year alone, U.S. subs have sunk more than 600. With so many American subs so close to Japan, they are beginning to run out of targets. Half of Japan's merchant fleet and almost two-thirds of her tanker fleet now lie at the bottom of the Pacific. For an island nation dependent upon trade, losses of this magnitude spell disaster. While the Japanese have developed better tactics to track and sink subs, it is too little, too late. With the Imperial Navy all but wiped out, there is no one left to protect the trading vessels, which until now have brought the home islands their very life's blood. That blood is now in the water, and the steel sharks of the Silent Service are in a feeding frenzy. December 1944, after a summer of brilliant victories, three factors combined to make any advance by the Western Allies beyond the German frontier problematic. First, the benefits of capturing the port of Antwerp have only just started to trickle through to the front. Thus, the majority of supply trains still originate from the distant beaches of Normandy. Next, heavier than normal autumn rains hamper the mobility that has, to now, marked the Allies' advance. Finally, with their homeland literally at their backs, German defenders are fighting with renewed determination. Nevertheless, the Allies do make gains. In the south, General George Patton's Third Army takes the fortress city of Metz and bellies up to the Siegfried Line near the German city of Saarbrücken. In Metz, the mopping up operation still involves clearing the labyrinth of tunnels and corridors beneath the city's forts. Soldiers of Major General John Milliken's Third Corps press forward, capturing the city's center and moving on to its western fortifications, where some German units still hold out. Meanwhile, to the northeast, the 4th Armored Division leads the American charge into the Saar Basin. On 2 December, the 95th Infantry Division captures a bridge over the Saar and proceeds to secure the area by destroying some 50 West Wall pillboxes. While the Third Army draws up to the German frontier, the U.S. 7th and French 6th Armies complete General Eisenhower's broad front strategy. This is done by attacks in southeastern France that enables Eisenhower's armies to share in a somewhat straight and contiguous front. For the French, this time proves to be especially satisfying. Nearly 4.5 years after the Wehrmacht steamrolled them into capitulation, a French army is fighting its way to the Rhine. Symbolism notwithstanding, this achievement nearly completes the total expulsion of German forces from French soil. By 15 December, the Western Allies are slowing down. Although no geographical obstacle has stopped them for long, the laws of logistics are inviolable. The broad front strategy is proving to be an insatiable giant, consuming supplies at an unbelievable rate, 600 to 700 tons per division per day, by Ike's own estimate. Additionally, the battle-weary French Tommies and GIs need rest and refitting. Yes, the vice squeezing the life out of the Nazis has stopped, but only momentarily. Soon these dog faces, resting safely in the quiet Ardennes, will press on to finish the job. But for right now, it's time to enjoy the scenery. Time to relax and bask in the gratitude of the newly liberated Belgian people. Time to look forward to Christmas, 1944. 9 December 1944, England. The tenor of the war is changing with each new Allied advance across the Rhineland. Perhaps just how much so is best illustrated in England, where the government has dismissed the Home Guard and relaxed blackout regulations. With the first rumblings of war, local men across England who were either too old or too young to join the military gathered spontaneously in local militias. They vowed to defend their homes from the enemy should he be bold enough to invade English soil. These local defense volunteers received official sanction in May of 1940, when then Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden announced the formation of a citizen army. At the urging of new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, this army became known as the Home Guard. Home Guard members crossed all class and occupational lines. They donned the British khaki uniform. They trained, as much as 48 hours a month, in the use of weapons they never seemed to have enough of. Often as not, they found themselves with regular Army cast-offs, or whatever they could scrounge from home. Many of their fellow countrymen questioned their credibility as soldiers. To Churchill, however, the Home Guard represented the British spirit, the determination to fight wherever necessary, on the beaches, in the fields, streets, and hills. Still, as the sanctity of British soil remained untried by German invasion, the Home Guard's job became less one of citizen soldier and more one of civil defense monitor. Their importance, however, should not be underestimated. During the terrifying days and nights when air raid sirens signaled inevitable destruction and loss of life, the Home Guard was there to scan the sky for German bombers, man anti-aircraft guns, and help rescue the wounded. They guarded bridges and coastlines, releasing countless regular soldiers to fight the enemy abroad. Often, they worked for days with no sleep at all, on duty for their country by night, toiling at regular jobs by day. Yet their resolve held. Important though it is, the dismissal of the Home Guard is probably less indicative of the progress of the war than the announcement that British officials have lessened blackout restrictions. Imposed in 1939 to prevent German bombers from having a beacon by which to identify English targets, full blackout is deemed no longer necessary. Gone are the terrifying days when German bombers filled the skies over England. Most of the airborne threat now is from unmanned rockets. Darkened streets are no defense against the randomness with which they wreak their destruction. New regulations recognize this fact and permit dim street lighting as long as it is no brighter than that of the moon. This is a relief to those who have lived for many years under the unforgiving, total darkness of the blackout. It is, one American journalist has noted, profound, terrifying, and impenetrable. Others have called it inhuman, and the complete and utter void that it has wrought on moonless nights has made many Britons loath to leave their houses. Things are different now. The approximation of moonlight will make streets friendlier and more navigable. So far, the relaxed regulations are in place, but the government has not implemented them. Britons wait anxiously for this welcome relief from what many consider to be the greatest hardship of the war. And with them wait people everywhere. For if the lights come on again in England, however dimly, it kindles hope for the day that they will again shine brightly all over the world. 6 December 1944, the Philippines. Since the day General Douglas MacArthur was forced to leave the Philippines, he has been determined to return. Now, having succeeded in doing so, landing at Leyte on 20 October, he intends to work his way up the archipelago, wresting island after island from the Japanese until he reaches and frees the capital city of Manila on the island of Luzon. Like crossing a country stream on stepping stones, MacArthur must reach each point in his plan before he can attempt the next one. And so, before he can return to Luzon, he must secure Mindoro and build enough airfields there to launch the bombers, fighters, and tactical reconnaissance flights needed to support an assault on the capital. In turn, before MacArthur can move against Mindoro, his troops must control Leyte. But the pieces of the general's plan are not falling into place. Japanese reinforcements on Leyte have thrown a wrench into his timetable. Now it will be longer than he had hoped before he can walk down the main street of Manila and savor the ultimate satisfaction of his return. MacArthur originally planned to be on Mindoro by 5 December and on Luzon by 20 December. Leyte changed all that when fighting there dragged on far longer than projected. The key to cracking the Japanese defense on Leyte is the port city of Ormoc, site of the main Japanese base on the island. Mac orders General Andrew Bruce's 77th Infantry to land near Ormoc, encircle the city from the north and south, and drive a wedge through the Japanese defenses. The Japanese send reinforcements toward Ormoc from other parts of the island, but U.S. Army Air Force and Marine planes repel them. Only 3 days after the initial assault, following advance firing by artillery, mortars, and rocket-firing landing craft, American tanks and infantry break through the Japanese defense into Ormoc itself. Bruce's infantry has divided the Japanese forces on Leyte. To complete the American invasion strategy, other U.S. units now begin moving northward to encircle and conquer the Emperor's troops. The impatient MacArthur, considering Leyte to be virtually in U.S. hands, checks it off his list. He looks now to Mindoro. Washington's top brass and many of MacArthur's own staff consider this premature assault on Mindoro risky at best. Although the island is lightly defended, it is well within the reach of Japanese aircraft based near Manila. MacArthur, however, has bet that General Tomoyuki Yamashita will let the Americans have Mindoro without a fight, conserving his strength for the inevitable struggle for Luzon. So far, MacArthur is winning that bet. On 15 December, GIs of the 24th Infantry Division go ashore unopposed. They disembark from their LSTs onto dry land and advance against light resistance. Mindoro, a mountainous, tropical island, really has little to offer the Allies except proximity to Luzon. It is here, near the southwestern city of San Jose and the Mangarin Bay, that they will build the airfields that will provide them access to their next objective, Lingayen Gulf. Right now, their main priority is to have in place by 20 December at least one airstrip capable of accommodating a fighter group. By the first week of the new year, however, they will need to have enough airfields in place to provide air support for the entire operation. MacArthur has rescheduled the Lingayen landing for 9 January. Having delayed it once, it's unlikely that he will postpone again his ultimate moment of triumph. December 1944, Germany in the Pacific. Before this war, in its long-range aircraft, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and now the B-29 Superfortress, strategic bombing was merely a theory, a what-if, discussed around the table in military planning rooms. What if a bomber could fly deep into an enemy's territory, strike at the heart of his supplies operation, and demoralize his people? Would war end sooner? Would lives of men slogging through the trenches and across battlefields on the ground be saved? Today, those questions are being answered. As Allied ground troops slowly break the German soldiers' will to fight, the mighty bombers of the British and U.S. Air Forces pound the German homeland in an attempt to break Der Führer's capacity to fight. The Emperor of Japan and his people are faring no better. As American-made fire and death begin to rain from the skies on their home islands, many in the land of the rising sun are learning a new respect for the sleeping giant they so arrogantly awakened just 3 years ago. The Allies' strategic bombing campaign has delivered nearly 200,000 tons of deadly payload on communication, transportation, and industrial centers across Germany, dealing blow after deadly blow to Hitler's war-making capacity. But the Allied air forces aren't placing all of their explosive eggs in one strategic basket. As the men of the 1st and 3rd Armies push tenaciously to Germany, B-26 Marauders of the U.S. 9th Air Force provide tactical support for their efforts. In a matter of days, the U.S. 9th Air Force alone flies 1,300 combat sorties and drops 2,500 tons of bombs on Germany's bridges, highway junctions, rail yards, gun positions, supply dumps, and airfields. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign in the Pacific is just beginning to gather steam. Bases in the Marianas Islands, only 1,500 miles from the Japanese homeland, are proving much more convenient to targets. Even in the Marianas, however, they face obstacles. The pilots' training is limited. They are unfamiliar with operating in the jet stream, where winds routinely exceed 100 knots, and the 21st has no better weather forecast facilities than the 20th. It's not surprising, then, that the B-29's efforts have met with limited success so far. But with closer proximity to Japan and time, the odds are turning in their favor. On 31 October, a B-29 of the 21st flew a high-altitude reconnaissance mission over Tokyo. It was the first flight from Tinian in the Marianas Islands, and its success buoyed the U.S. fighting spirit. In the weeks that followed, the 21st practiced for a high-altitude bombing attack on Tokyo using Iwo Jima as its target. Finally, on 24 November, 111 Superforts took to the sky for the mass raid on the Masashima Aircraft Works in the Japanese capital. The results were disappointing, as more than half of the mighty bombers missed their mark. When they tried again 3 days later, the outcome wasn't any better. On both occasions, they couldn't overcome bad weather, and they still hadn't learned to compensate for the high winds of the jet stream. Still, they persist. In addition to Tokyo, the U.S. Air Forces have made assaults on strategic transportation and industrial targets in Bangkok and Omura, and are preparing for raids on Japanese bases in China. While the superfortress hasn't proven to be a great success yet, with forward bases in the Marianas and the fact that they are virtually impervious to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, it is likely that their effectiveness will increase. Their efforts thus far have sent Japanese citizens scrambling for cover. Each time a B-29 successfully strikes the Japanese homeland, it reminds the enemy just how vulnerable he now is to Allied attack. The despair of the Japanese people can only deepen as death continues to rain from the skies, and the superfortress gets ever nearer to fulfilling its promise of ultimate defeat. 16 December 1944, Belgium. American soldiers resting in the wintry calm of the Ardennes are abruptly awakened this morning by mortars, rockets, and artillery fire. Thousands of pinpoints of light illuminate the splintering trees and heaving ground as the stunned GIs hunker down in their foxholes. None of these dogfaces believed the Nazis could, or would, mount an assault of such fury here at the end of the war. Along an 85-mile front from Echternach in the south to Monschau in the north, the roar of German tank engines and the scream of artillery echo through the bitter cold of the forest. In many cases, soldiers find themselves alone and isolated as the shadowy forms of German infantrymen thrash by them on their way west. But this offensive is the brainchild of Adolf Hitler himself, who cannot conceive of an Allied victory over his army of Aryan supermen. Formulated shortly after the failed attempt on his life in July, the Führer's plan hinged on launching the attack in early December, when the foul weather would ground British and American planes and nullify Allied air supremacy. The main objective of the Führer's surprise offensive is Antwerp, and he has devised a precise timetable for its capture. If the Wehrmacht can retake the crucial port city, they will drive a wedge between the Americans in the south and the British in the north. Though his generals felt that the plan was madness, the Führer's will won the day. The bewildered generals retreated from Hitler's fantasy world to the real world, where they have tried to make something of his plan. Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Wilhelm Mödel were assigned the task of implementing the offensive. Under the strictest of secrecy, they assembled all available German reserves into a formidable fighting force of more than 200,000 men. General Sepp Dietrich, or Staunch Old Dietrich, as Hitler calls him, leads his 6th SS Panzer Army in the northern flank of the assault. The diminutive General Hasso von Manteuffel commands the 5th Panzer Army, attacking in the center along the same routes covered in 1940. In the south, General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army protects Manteuffel's flank as they race for the Meuse. The German troops drive headlong into battle with Rundstedt's last exhortation echoing in their ears: "We gamble everything." Allied intelligence is just as confused by the assault as the GIs in the foxholes. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, had thought the Germans were beaten and that they would spend the winter stalling for time to rebuild the armies shattered by the Allies in the fall campaigns. SHAEF assumed the Germans would try to make their last stand in the spring amongst the deadly entanglements of the West Wall. As the American lines crumble, Eisenhower, sporting a newly conferred 5th star and fresh from his orderly's wedding, meets with General Omar Bradley in Versailles to discuss the implications of the attack. Bradley suggests it might be a spoiling attack designed to weaken American morale by ruining their Christmas. The men in the lines had, after all, come to believe the war would be over by then. The Supreme Commander fears it is more. He has a gut feeling that something big is up. He immediately orders the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions into the line, hoping they will stem the tide of the offensive by bringing relief to the besieged units in the forest. This is of little comfort to the men of Major General Walter E. Lauer's 99th Infantry Division, recently arrived from the States. These green men find themselves facing the brunt of Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army. In the cold, isolated village of Lanzerat, a small and badly outnumbered company of GIs from the 99th holds off repeated vicious Nazi assaults. The bone-weary foot soldiers watch in horror as their tank support flees to the rear. One GI notes wryly, "They might at least wave goodbye." The main body of the 99th, fighting along Elsenborn Ridge, gets unexpected help when the 2nd Infantry Division retreats through their lines. The unit had been conducting an attack to the north when 5th Corps Commander General Leonard T. Gero, surprised by the offensive, pulled them back to help the 99th at Elsenborn. In a daring series of fighting withdrawals, the veteran infantrymen of the 2nd assumed defensive positions alongside the 99th. Once his unit is in position, the commander of the 2nd, Major General Walter Robertson, assumes command of both units. With the firs of the Elsenborn for cover, and with liberal artillery support, the soldiers manage to dig in. Now, they wait to see what fate and the Führer have in store. Another inexperienced unit that has just set foot on the continent is Major General Allen W. Jones' 106th Infantry Division. Receiving a bloody baptism of artillery fire from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, the terror-stricken unit becomes confused and disorganized in the fog. Stationed farthest east of any Allied unit amidst the pines of the Schnee-Eifel, the Hardlock 106th receives contradictory orders throughout 17 and 18 December. Men, trudging back and forth through the dark forests again and again, find themselves fighting pitched battles with small German units. The 7th Armored Division, hurrying to aid the 106th in their defense of the strategic village of Saint-Vite, is delayed and disrupted by American troops fleeing to the rear. The tankers finally reach the contested village, but they're too late. In the biggest mass surrender of Americans since Bataan, almost 9,000 men of the 106th have been surrounded by the Germans and marched into captivity. Hardest hit of all are the men of Major General Norman Cota's 28th Infantry Division, who already were known as the Bloody Bucket Division because of the grievous casualties they took in the grim battle for the Hürtgen Forest. Panicked soldiers flee to the rear in short order. Commanders watch in horror as whole units are wiped out or put to rout. Unbeknownst to the officers, small pockets of GIs remain at the front and buy time for their retreating brothers by fighting valiantly from positions in the rubble of houses and hotels in small towns like Clairvaux and Wiltz. As evening descends upon the Ardennes on 20 December, German soldiers have made massive gains in what appears to be a great victory. But their commanders are careful not to take too much satisfaction in their work just yet. Manteuffel in particular realizes pockets of American resistance have disrupted the timetable so crucial to the Führer's plans. Unless these men can be eliminated, the whole offensive is in danger of failure. Among his concerns is the inevitable reaction of the Allies to atrocities committed by the SS during the fighting. More than 90 civilians have been gunned down in the tiny village of Stavlo by troops of the 1st SS Division. To make matters worse, there are reports of American prisoners of war being executed near Malmedy. Within hours, word is spread through the German and American commands that stormtroopers have summarily executed 86 of 125 GIs who surrendered in the tiny Belgian village. All along the front, German soldiers pick through the spoils of war, finding time for a smoke or a chocolate bar. But as the weather grows harsher, snow and fog settle over the forest, American soldiers find their hearts filling with unspeakable anger. In their foxholes, cold, exhausted, and bitter with the desire for revenge, the GIs sit. They know now there will be no peace by Christmas. With thoughts of home filling their hearts, they know now they must fight on this foreign ground for yet a few more weeks. Perhaps next Christmas. December 1944, Europe, even amidst the worst carnage in human history. The men fighting this war take a moment today to reflect on happier, more peaceful times. For the rookie on the front lines, the cold, lonely foxhole is a world away from Christmas a year ago. Then, the war was in the newspapers and on the radio, an affair far distant from home, family, or sweetheart. For the veteran GI, this day's reflection elicits memories of that first Christmas in North Africa, where seas of sand and blistering heat were a poor substitute for fields of snow and winter's icy bite. Still, there were the friends that you shared that Christmas with. Many of them would stay in North Africa forever. Some of them would celebrate Christmas 1943, slogging up the boot in Italy, while your unit was sent to England training for the big cross-channel jump. Yeah, you thought about those boys while you shared the holiday spirit and comforts of home with an English family. You wonder how many of them are still around celebrating this Christmas. You wonder about the Germans you're facing here in the Ardennes. This Christmas doesn't seem to matter to them as they try to push you all the way back to Normandy, yet you hear the strains of Stille Nacht coming from their side of the lines. They're probably doing the same thing you are, remembering better Christmas past, better times. In a few hours, or a few minutes, you'll be back at the grim business of trying to win a war. But for now, you allow the spirit of the moment to form an invisible bond with those plaintive voices in the woods. You think about your brother in the Pacific. Boy, what you wouldn't do to be with him right now. Oh well. This cup of Christmas cheer that somebody passes off for coffee will have to do. And Merry Christmas, 1944. 9 January 1945, Lingayen Gulf, Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur's plan for the conquest of the Philippines archipelago was opposed by some Washington strategists and by President Roosevelt himself, who thought the logical next step from Leyte was Formosa. But the general won a heated debate on the subject by promising to take all the Philippine Islands on a timetable far more optimistic than any proposed for the capture of Formosa. Now, with mopping up action still underway on Leyte, MacArthur already is 3 weeks behind. He is more than ready to begin his assault on Luzon. MacArthur's invasion point is a secret to no one. The inviting and strategically sound horseshoe-shaped beach at the Lingayen Gulf, halfway up Luzon's western coast, is the same place the Japanese occupiers landed in 1941. In order to assure air superiority for the Luzon invasion, the Allies took Mindoro Island just south of Luzon on 15 December. By 23 December, Australian and American air crews had built the complex of runways needed, a full week ahead of schedule. On 4 January, en route to soften up the landing beaches at Lingayen, Vice Admiral Jesse Ohlendorf's battle fleet was introduced to a novel and deadly Japanese weapon, the kamikaze. The one-man fighters appeared in successive waves, vying for the opportunity to plunge directly into Allied warships, happily trading their lives for emperor and honor. American fighters, taking off from carriers and from the new airstrips at Mindoro, set up a tight curtain of air defense around Ohlendorf's ships. Though the majority of the suicide planes were ravaged in a blanket of American fire, some managed to slip through. And in the new world of the kamikaze, some were more than enough. As Ohlendorf's fleet moved to within 150 miles of Lingayen, they entered the range of Japanese fighters based on Luzon, and the kamikazes increased in number. On 6 January, the ships entered Lingayen Gulf, and the kamikaze attacks heightened to hysteric levels. Bad luck haunted the Americans as a thick, overcast sky grounded most of their flying force. To the suicide dive bombers already set on death, the clouds, by masking their approach, merely improved their chances for success. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were among the American casualties. All told, the kamikaze damaged or sank 30 Allied vessels. The new Japanese threat had proven itself an issue that the Americans must address. And with the rising of the sun on 7 January, address it they did. Under clear skies, American fighters attacked and obliterated the Japanese airfields on Luzon, effectively putting an end to the kamikaze threat in the Philippines. With air superiority secured, the Americans began bombarding the beaches at Lingayen Gulf, intent on softening up the heavy resistance they expected to meet when they finally went ashore. At 9:30 a.m. on 9 January, the first of 200,000 men of Kruger's 6th Army start their landing, without opposition. All dressed up and ready to fight, the Americans find themselves stood up at Lingayen Gulf. Not a single Japanese defender is in sight. The no-show is part of Japanese General Yamashita's defensive scheme. His 250,000-man army is imposing, but it is not nearly large enough to deny the Americans a beachhead or even to defend all of Luzon. With the bulk of the Empire's fleet sunk at Leyte, Yamashita understands that he will not be getting reinforcements. Nevertheless, he plans to fight a long and stubborn defense that will drain the Allied army. Accordingly, Yamashita breaks his forces into 3 separate groups and positions them defensively in a complex network of entrenchments in the mountains surrounding Lingayen Gulf. Each of the 3 groups, the Shobo, Kembu, and Shimbu, is responsible for a specific area and its tactical sites. The Shobo group, the largest of the 3, is under Yamashita's personal command in North Luzon. With a 17-mile beachhead intact, 1 Corps begins its mission of seizing a crucial roadway junction in order to protect the flank of 14 Corps as it moves south toward Clark Air Base in Manila. When Yamashita's well-dug-in Shobo group stops 1 Corps' advance and prevents them getting into position to support the 14th, MacArthur instructs Kruger to move on to Manila anyway. Opposition is non-existent until 23 January, when the Americans run full speed into the determined Kembu group guarding Clark Air Base. Unlike their kamikaze brothers, These Japanese defenders have been content to let the Americans come to them. They know the Americans must have Clark if they are to control the Philippines, and they are prepared to make them pay for it. December 1944, Belgium. Along a crumbling front in the Belgian Ardennes, U.S. soldiers are engaged in desperate combat against their suddenly resurgent German foes. Nazi Panzer Grenadiers, flush with victory, have advanced out of the snow, attacking and overpowering unprepared and disorganized American units. U.S. commanders, lost in the fog of unexpected battle, have ordered retreats on a massive scale as the Germans press forward, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. But small pockets of stubborn U.S. resistance have cost the German juggernaut precious time. In Europe and back home, newspapers already have coined the phrase Battle of the Bulge. As news of the German victories and German atrocities grows, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower attempts to regain control over the situation. He splits General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. General George S. Patton's 3rd Army in the South will remain directly under Bradley's control. In the North, Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges' 1st Army and Lieutenant General William H. Simpson's 9th Army are given to none other than milquetoast British Commander Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The command change has an immediate payoff, as Montgomery commits the British 30 Corps to back up U.S. tank units deployed along the Meuse River. Should the Germans attempt to breach the river, they will be in for a tough fight. On the other hand, Montgomery's cautious approach and the inept manner in which he deals with his subordinates immediately irritates the Americans whom he commands. The American sensibilities are rankled by Monty's absolute conviction that his arrival in command will save the day. For the moment, Eisenhower has more important problems to deal with. Through a fluke, one of the many that will affect the outcome of this battle, Eisenhower's reserve unit, the 101st Airborne Division, accidentally finds itself alone and cut off in the strategic hamlet of Bastogne. To make matters worse, the 101st's commander and executive commander are on leave. It will fall to the division's artillery commander, Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe, to lead the division into battle against a force 3 times its size. Bastogne is like the hub of a wheel, where 6 important roads intersect like spokes, and German units are closing in from all sides. McAuliffe decides to make a stand. His men, a hodgepodge of units including some elements of the 10th Armored Division, have made the 100-mile journey from Mourmelon-le-Grand, France, in open trucks. Nevertheless, he sends them immediately into the dark woods surrounding Bastogne. Reports reach McAuliffe of grisly clashes at Neuville, Magrez, and Marville. German panzer tanks are pressing forward with deadly malice. Like tigers in the snow, they hunt the paratroopers, intent on devouring them. With each passing hour, it is clearer that the situation is desperate for the Americans. Still, all attempts by German forces to enter Bastogne itself are repulsed by the veteran GIs. On 20 December, the embattled Americans are completely encircled and vastly outnumbered by German forces. As the battle to take the town escalates, supplies run low for the 101st, and the weather continues to worsen. Allied planes, still grounded by heavy fog, can do nothing to bring relief to Bastogne. Casualties mount. Clerks, cooks, and service troops find themselves pressed into frontline service. As one of McAuliffe's aides puts it, the 101st is the hole in the donut. Still, the Americans in the besieged city refuse to give up, and even as they struggle for survival, a plan is hatched at General Eisenhower's headquarters. General Patton tells Eisenhower he will drive to Bastogne and relieve the 101st. Many on Ike's staff scoff at the idea that Patton can halt his Third Army in the midst of a major winter offensive, swing north, then resupply without rest, and, in frigid weather, march to the relief of the encircled defenders. Patton knows the situation in Bastogne is desperate. and he knows his soldiers will come through. Before attending the meeting with Ike, Patton already has ordered his staff to implement the plan. On 22 December, Patton's terrible swift sword swings northward toward Bastogne and the relief of McAuliffe. It will be days before Patton can reach the paratroopers, if he can reach them at all. But with defeat seemingly inevitable, the battered bastards of Bastogne awaken on 23 December to the drone of C-47 engines. The weather is cleared, and supplies rain down on the trapped men like manna from heaven. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters hammer at German positions. Like sheep, the unprotected tanks and vehicles of the panzer divisions are lined up for the slaughter on the open roads leading into Bastogne. Fortified and resupplied, the Yanks in the encircled city suddenly find new hope. The Nazi forces continue to advance with Teutonic tenacity, but the boys in Bastogne fight back stubbornly. Both sides are aware that Patton's army will break through soon. The now panicked Germans send wave after wave of grenadiers in white snow gear against the dug-in paratroopers. On Christmas Day, the Nazis try one last major assault. When the American paratroopers begin falling back, Bayerlein believes his victory is at hand. Patton will come too late. But the retreat of the 101st is a clever ruse by McAuliffe. The crafty Yanks have lured the Germans into a trap. As the Panzer Lehr troops and tanks pursue the fleeing paratroopers, U.S. tank destroyers burst forward from their hiding places in the woods and blast the stunned attackers. Their assault capabilities spent, the Germans change tactics. They send an ultimatum demanding surrender of the town. McAuliffe replies simply, "Nuts." Enraged, the Germans loose a hellish barrage of artillery on Bastogne. Shells of all types rain down upon the exposed city, setting fires, leveling houses, and killing scores of American soldiers and Belgian civilians. Still, the paratroopers grimly hold on. Upon hearing the news of McAuliffe's reply, Patton redoubles his efforts to relieve the city. "Drive like hell," he orders his men. While the men of the 101st pass an uneasy Christmas, Patton's 4th Armored Division pushes forward in bitter conditions. On 26 December, their lead tanks blast through a lone pillbox near the town of Assenois. Relief has come at last to Bastogne. In short order, McAuliffe radios, "We're in fine shape. We're ready to take the offensive." The jubilation is short-lived. While Patton's men inflict heavy losses on the Germans in short order, the surviving Nazi units still have plenty of fight left. At Allied headquarters, it is becoming evident that, while the battle is far from over, it is not lost. With the victory at Bastogne and the efforts of American units in the northern and southern flanks, the tide of Hitler's offensive is turning. At Nazi headquarters, too, it is becoming apparent that the offensive is in trouble. Bastogne has become an abscess in their lines, and its very name rings bitter in their ears. December 1944, Leyte. Although General Douglas MacArthur declared the island of Leyte to be under U.S. control on 10 December, someone evidently forgot to tell the Japanese. Fighting to the bitter end, they have continued to mount bloody and brutal counterattacks against U.S. forces on the island. The Americans who have repelled most of these advances, the tired and battered troops of General Walter Kruger's 6th Army, now are looking forward to a little rest and relaxation. Their commander will join MacArthur to plan for the coming invasion of Japan, and Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army will finish whatever mopping up remains to be done on Leyte. On the surface, Leyte hardly seems to have been worth the price Americans have paid for it. Seasonal monsoon rains deluged the island shortly after the GIs arrived, making its airfields useless. Engineers are still behind schedule in the construction of new ones. But though MacArthur's strategic plan for Leyte isn't panning out, the U.S. has made other gains that he could not have foreseen. Leyte has been especially costly for the Japanese. In the days since the first U.S. soldiers set foot on the beaches near Tacloban and Dulag, the Japanese have suffered nearly 70,000 casualties. Fewer than 500 have opted to suffer the ultimate disgrace of surrendering. U.S. casualties, on the other hand, number approximately 15,000. But the Japanese have paid another, even higher price to make their stand at Leyte. On Leyte and in the waters surrounding it, the Japanese have met their Waterloo. The great Japanese naval and air fleets no longer exist. With these assets decimated, Japan, in effect, has no long-range offensive power with which to defend the remaining islands in the Philippines. Indeed, the home islands, already open to aerial attacks by US B-29 since June, are even more vulnerable without the Emperor's navy to protect them. The Rising Sun's remaining strength lies primarily in a finite number of the dreaded and lethal kamikaze pilots, but it remains to be seen if they alone will be able to affect the ultimate outcome of the war. Having fought and won at Leyte, MacArthur already has turned his attention to the liberation of Luzon and the rest of the Philippines. Whether to invade Luzon at all was vehemently argued among the American High Command. Some Washington strategists, including President Roosevelt, believed that once Leyte was taken, the Americans, with a foothold in the Philippines, would be able to use the base to go straight for Formosa, one step closer to Tokyo. In a meeting with the President and other commanders, MacArthur violently disagreed. He could not accept leaving any of the Philippines, which he abandoned in 1942, under Japanese control. The general won the argument when he boldly claimed he could assault Luzon months ahead of the proposed timetable for taking Formosa. But now, the general is weeks behind his scheduled landing date at Lingayen. The Japanese defenses on Leyte reflected the island's importance to the Imperial Command, and no one, not even MacArthur, could have foreseen the terrible price the Japanese were willing to pay to keep it. January 1945, Eastern Front. From the Baltic to the Balkans, the juggernaut that is the Soviet Red Army has steamrolled the once vaunted Wehrmacht. Though the Russians have suffered horrendous casualties at the hands of the Germans, they have been replaced almost immediately from a seemingly inexhaustible supply of manpower. Germany's eastern allies, Finland, Romania, and Bulgaria, also had fought the good fight against the Bolsheviks. Now each has been forced to sue for peace. The Baltic states have been recaptured and the Ukraine liberated. The Soviet Union has inflicted on the German army the worst defeat in its history. The Russian war machine has rested for 5 months, its armies drawn up to the Vistula River. In that time, the Red Army has consolidated its gains, reorganized and stockpiled resources in preparation for its next objective, the Oder River. Now the Soviet offensive finally explodes as 2 army groups push west, followed by a third 2 days later. The 3 outmanned German army groups attempting to stem the tide are no match. Red Army officers, having learned the art of blitzkrieg the hard way, now prove to their teachers they are not only apt students, but skilled practitioners. Even the designated fortress cities created to act as breakwaters against the red tide are enveloped and reduced without slowing the Soviet momentum. Nazi leadership finds it can do nothing to harden its citizens and soldiers to the deadly and terrifying specter of Soviet lead and steel. Appeals to patriotism, threats, even summary executions fail to stiffen German resistance. Additionally, critical fuel shortages hobble the German army, making its soldiers little more than sitting ducks. Der Führer's disastrous policy of not one step back is once again enforced, and his armies repeatedly are denied opportunities to retreat to defensible terrain. Hitler's fanatical delusion that the will of the individual German can overcome any military deficiency has rung the death knell for the Third Reich. For many Russian soldiers, this drive across Poland is sweet revenge for years of humiliation. From the brink of defeat, hundreds of miles deep in their homeland, they have endured and rebounded. In liberating their country, they have forced their Nazi occupiers to atone for the horrors they perpetrated on villages, homes, and loved ones. The rage that is burned in the Russian belly now gives rise to Russian savagery. Before the Red Army reaches the Oder, its soldiers will breathe the sweet smoke of German homes ablaze and hear the music of German cries for mercy. Revenge is a vintage that has long been fermenting in the Soviet Union. And now, many in the Red Army will drink deep. 6 January 1945, Belgium. As the Battle of the Bulge wears on and the Allies struggle to regain control of the war, Adolf Hitler continues to demonstrate that, although he is mad, he is too clever to be written off yet. Throughout the European theater of operations, American soldiers are on the alert for Germans disguised as GIs. They are forced to take strong and sometimes elaborate measures to foil attempts at penetration of their lines. Der Führer, attempting to gain a psychological advantage over his enemies, has ordered the creation of a special commando unit led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny has been tagged by the Allies as the most dangerous man in Europe because of his daring rescue of Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop in Italy. Skorzeny's Special Panzer Brigade, dressed in captured American uniforms and equipped with American tanks and vehicles, is under orders to penetrate the Allied lines and seize strategic bridges along the Meuse River. Unfortunately for Skorzeny, his brigade is bedeviled from the outset. While his troops may speak English, many have not mastered American slang and they have trouble passing. Worse, their captured American equipment is in poor shape. Unable to accomplish even the first phase of his mission, Skorzeny wisely gives up and commits the bulk of his 2,000-man unit to the support of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Not so his 4-man Jeep teams. 30 of these teams set out to infiltrate and wreak havoc behind U.S. lines. Armed principally with daring and guile, 9 managed to obtain their objectives of switching signs, blocking roads, and causing the diversion of American units. One group, when captured, causes even greater disruption to American military operations by confessing a fantastic and completely fabricated plot to assassinate Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower suddenly finds himself a virtual prisoner in his own headquarters. His security forces take extreme measures to protect him from the non-existent danger. At the front, crafty GIs alerted to the presence of the German infiltrators devise their own ingenious security procedures. They quiz suspicious GIs on aspects of life at home only a true American would know about. Where is Lil Abner's hometown? Who won the pennant this year? Even General Omar Bradley comes under scrutiny. The 12th Army Group commander is repeatedly halted by zealous MPs. Ultimately, most of the Nazi commando teams are run to ground. They receive proper, if quick, trials, and most are shortly executed as spies. In the northern salient of the Bulge, the fight takes on grim overtones around the village of Saint-Vite. The 7th Armored Division, still without winter gear, fights desperately to hold the strategic town. Despite their efforts, the Germans slowly gain the upper hand. Finally, after the battle has deteriorated to the terror of house-to-house and sometimes hand-to-hand combat, the 7th's commanding general, Robert Hasbrouck, is ordered to withdraw. But even retreat proves difficult as the division's tanks become mired in the muddy roads leading out of town. After an anxious day, Mother Nature takes the GI's part. Plummeting temperatures freeze and harden the muck enough for the armored Frigidaires to escape. In a flurry of automatic weapons fire and supported by tanks of their own, German soldiers charge into the village behind the fleeing Americans. Even in retreat, the dogfaces make the Nazis pay for their victory. Valiant rearguard troops in armored cars manage to destroy several Tiger tanks, even with the German infantry snapping at their heels. In the dark woods around Dambutkenbach and Monschau, Brigadier General Clift Andrus' 1st Infantry Division hunts down and dispatches a group of holdouts from an elite German paratroop unit, which had surrendered on 23 December after a botched assault on the village of Malmedy. Having recovered from the initial shock of the German offensive, the Americans slowly regroup. At the hamlet of Baraque de Fretieux, the 3rd Armored Division and the 82nd Airborne Division meet the 2nd SS Panzer Division in bloody toe-to-toe combat. The fanatical Germans attack the 82nd again and again along a difficult-to-defend 15-mile front. General James Gavin's calls for support are at last answered by the 7th Armored Division, fresh from the battle at Saint-Vite, and by the 9th Armored Division. Still, the battle rages until Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who has been given command of the American troops in the north by Ike, personally orders a withdrawal to tidy up the battlefield. Gavin is loath to pull his men back, so he orders a fighting retreat. Soon, however, the men of Gavin's command are again on the offensive. Within days, the Americans have consolidated the front line and are able to send troops to help contain the German push to the south. The bitterest fighting centers on the castle at Celle, only a few miles from the Meuse River. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding general of the 2nd Armored Division, has marched his unit more than 70 miles from the Aachen area to help stem the German advance. Within minutes of receiving reports that the 2nd Panzer Division is pressing forward, he asks for and receives permission to attack. The Americans rout their enemy in short order. As its fuel supplies begin to run out, the Panzer Division is unable to use its tanks effectively. The Americans watch jubilantly as the Germans abandon their armor and begin retreating on foot. In the south, General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, fresh from its triumph at Bastogne, pushes resolutely northward. After fighting bitterly for the woods above Bastogne, Patton's men are able to link up with the 1st Army near Uffalise on 16 January. Field Marshal Geert von Rundstedt, having consulted with his senior staff, asks Hitler for permission to withdraw from the Bastogne area. Der Führer at first angrily refuses. Hitler already has accepted that his Wehrmacht will not be able to reach Antwerp. Perhaps thinking of a negotiated peace with the Allies, he advises his generals, above all, we must have Bastogne. But as he learns that the American 6th Armored, 26th Infantry and 87th Infantry Divisions are pressing westward to bolster American defenses in that city, he is forced to accept that it, too, has slipped from his grasp. With casualties mounting to horrific levels, the bully of the beer halls is forced to accept grim reality. Hitler decides his all-or-nothing offensive is over and turns his attention to the Russian front. Leaving his hapless generals in the Ardennes with no chance for triumph, he packs up his forward headquarters and on 17 January journeys back to Berlin, a bitter and broken man. 21 January 1945, Luzon. On the road to Manila, General Walter Kruger's 6th Army is driven by desire to atone for the American abandonment of Clark Field, which all but emasculated Allied Army and Navy power in the Philippines more than 3 years ago. As the largest air base in the Southern Pacific, and the only one capable of accommodating heavy bombers, Clark Field is key to the defenses of the Philippine Islands. Comprising more than a dozen runways and a battery of dispersal areas and associated installations, the Clark Field area extends for almost 15 miles. In desperate need of forward air support near Lingayen Gulf, Kruger orders Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold to move elements of his 14th Corps south to seize the airfield. Kruger's plan is to secure terrain north and west of Clark, then tighten the noose. Anticipating the Allied invasion, Japanese 14th Air Army Commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita places his Kembu Group in the mountainous country west of Clark. Even if he cannot hold the airfield, he intends to deny the Allies the use of it for as long as possible. Kembu Group numbers some 30,000 troops. The high ground it holds, along with an enormous supply of automatic weapons, gives it some advantage over the Americans. But the troops are green and inadequately trained. They are dug in with only rudimentary defenses and no heavy arms. Yamashita knows his hold is tenuous at best. Still, Kruger's men meet stiffening opposition as they near Clark. Japanese troops attack in numbers with small arms on the night of 21-22 January at La Paz. They materialize out of the night so suddenly and with such fury that the American response is at first weak and disorganized. As dawn approaches, the GIs find their bearings and begin beating back their attackers. On 23 January, the U.S. 160th Division secures the bomb-bound section of the base. As the Americans begin rooting out Japanese soldiers in the adjacent village, they come under increasingly heavy small arms fire from the low ridges of the nearby Zambales Mountains and from the banks of the Bamban River. Casualties mount as the GIs work to clear out the diehards, but by 25 January, they have solidified their position. Meanwhile, the 40th Division broadens its front to both the north and the south and slowly begins to clear the hills on the edge of Clark Field. Skirmishing costs the Americans few casualties, but the Kembo Group loses over 300 men. It takes until 27 January, but Japanese resistance is finally driven back and U.S. troops push on toward the center of Clark. Late on 28 January, U.S. forces finally control runway number 1. Elated, but nonetheless surprised by their quick success, Griswold and Kruger order elements of the 6th to press on toward Manila as quickly as possible. Kruger's main concern, however, is to drive the Japanese further back into the mountains, away from Clark. He wants to ensure the safety of the Allied engineers as they carry out much-needed construction at the airfield. For the moment, Yamashita remains in position to harass Clark from more than 30 fortified caves, each of which must be cleared out by American teams of flamethrowers and infantrymen before the full advance to Manila can continue. Griswold dispatches the 37th Infantry Division to carry out this grim task. Sweeping through the western portion of the field on 30 January, the 37th runs into trouble. Rather than facing isolated groups of Japanese holed up in caves, they find themselves in a fiery tangle of destroyed hangars and minefields. Progress grinds to a halt as engineers work feverishly to clear the way. In addition to throwing off Griswold's timetable, the mines take a terrible emotional toll on the men. Every stride is a step into the unknown, possibly into eternity. The assault must continue, however. The total seizure of Clark Field and its outposts hinges upon control of a large, bare-sloped hill called Top of the World because of its commanding view of the base. Delayed and pinned down by Japanese fire, the Americans are reduced to advancing at a crawl, sometimes close enough to meet the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Nevertheless, they secure the steep, grassy southern and southeastern slopes of the hill on 31 January. Finally, on the afternoon of 1st February, Clark Field is secure. More than 150 Americans have been killed in the taking of Clark Field, but the Japanese have cornered the market on casualties, losing more than 2,500 men. Renovations are beginning on the wreckage at Clark, and the flow of supplies down Route 3 and the Manila Railroad, along which future advances toward the capital can be supported, are unbroken once again. But if the recapture of the Philippines by Allied forces is inevitable, someone has forgotten to tell the Japanese, and they will make the Americans pay a heavy toll in lives before they are through. January 1945, Warsaw. Elements of the Soviet Red Army explode out of their Vistula River bridgeheads, and all eyes in this war-torn city look expectantly, if not a little apprehensively, toward their long-promised salvation. What form that salvation will take is the question weighing most heavily on the minds of the Poles. Although Stalin has presented his Red Army as liberators, he makes it clear to the other Allied nations that a restoration of Poland's pre-war eastern frontier is out of the question. To legitimize his claims, he forms the Polish National Committee in Lublin, and recognizes it as the legal Polish government. Although the National Committee is operating on Polish soil, it is clearly Stalin's puppet. The Red Army supplies its muscle. In one fell swoop, the Polish government in exile located in London has been disenfranchised. It remains to be seen if the continued recognition of the London Poles by the Western powers will have any effect on Stalin's plans. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Byelorussian Front now rips through the German defenses north and south of Warsaw. Although the foggy weather slows the Russian attackers somewhat, the sheer weight of men and materiel, coupled with the paucity of German defenders, makes the Red Army's advance irresistible. The German Ninth Army, guarding the city's approaches, in short order is split in two by Zhukov's forces. Once again, the vaunted German army, which has been magnificent when allowed to exercise the mobile doctrine it perfected, is reduced to a ripe-for-the-plucking static force by order of the increasingly paranoid Führer. The 4 incomplete battalions and few artillery batteries that constitute the garrison of Warsaw seek and receive permission from the German Army High Command to abandon the ruins of the city. They retreat to avoid encirclement. This common-sense maneuver drives Hitler into a state of apoplexy. Chief of the German General Staff, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, and 3 officers of his operations staff are subsequently detained and forced to explain their abandonment of Warsaw to the Gestapo. Now, long-suffering Warsaw is liberated. Along with units of the 1st Byelorussian Army, units of General Zygmunt Berling's 1st Polish Army enter the city. Warsaw, the first European capital to fall to Nazi aggression, becomes the last to be liberated. Next stop for the Soviet juggernaut, Berlin. January 1945, elements of the British 15th Corps execute the first of 2 planned amphibious landings on Romri Island in the Bay of Bengal. The scene is eerily reminiscent of a landing 2 weeks earlier on the island of Akyab, 100 miles to the north along Burma's Arakan coast. As before, the mostly West Indian troops come ashore to find the island apparently abandoned by its Japanese defenders. The landings at Akyab on 4 January were the 3rd attempt by the British to take the island and its strategically valuable airfields. After being repelled by withering Japanese defense on 2 previous occasions, the Allies landed this time to find the Emperor's Burma Area Army already had evacuated its divisions from the island to reinforce its defenses in central Burma. This turn of events, first at Akyab, now on Romri, reflects just how much and how quickly the balance of power has shifted in the China-Burma-India theater of operations. The Romri landing, commanded by Major General C.E.N. Lomax, is preceded by heavy naval and air bombardments, under which the enemy simply retreats to the island's interior. The Japanese still have at least 1 full division on Romri, but Lieutenant General Seiso Sakuri elects to make his stand further inland, perhaps hoping to tie up the Brits on the island for weeks, rather than spend his dwindling resources in a futile attempt to prevent their landing. The main focus of the Allies' Burma campaign has always been in the north. In fact, if the main lines of supply and communication between India and the Allied forces in China did not pass through northern Burma, the Allies might not be in this country at all. Since the old Burma Road was closed by the Japanese in 1941, supplies for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese National Army, as well as for the Flying Tigers of General Claire Chennault, have been flown over the Himalayas along a difficult route known as the Hump. So the Allies spent much of 1944 on military operations designed to drive the Japanese from the Huguan Valley and enable construction of a new land route into China from Lido. The occupation of Michino with its network of airfields made it possible to open a shorter and less dangerous air route than the Hump, but completion of the Lido Road remained a priority. In October, American Lieutenant General Daniel Sultan, commanding a fighting force that included American, British, and Chinese divisions, struck out south for Bhamo, which he took on 15 December. That same week, the British 14th Army, led by Lieutenant General William Uncle Bill Slim, established bridgeheads across the Chinwin River in central Burma. For both forces and for General Lomax in the south, the next step was the annihilation of the Burma Area Army. As Slim's army pushes toward Mandalay, British troops are hard at work preparing the airfields on Akyab to provide air support for his final assault. Meanwhile, the British West Indian troops on Ramri move steadily toward the island's interior, hoping to drive the Japanese off the lee shore and back to the Burmese mainland. On 22 January, the British tighten the noose by attacking the mainland city of Miabon, opposite Ramri, thereby cutting off Japanese coastal garrisons stationed there. This sets the stage for the bloodiest fighting of the Burma campaign since the Allied victory at Kohima. Meanwhile, Sultan's forces have pushed the enemy away from the vital Lido-Burma road intersection. Once the roads have been secured to the south, the Allies will be able to move supplies at will. The principal goals of Allied operations here included drawing off Japanese troops from the larger war in the Pacific and maintaining air bases in China for the eventual purpose of attacking the Emperor's home islands. But the capture of airfields in the Marianas in July 1944 has rendered the Chinese bases superfluous. And with the capture of Rangoon and Mandalay imminent, the clock is ticking, and time may be about up for CBI. 23 January 1945, Belgium. Revenge-minded Joes of the 7th Armored Division today launch a smashing frontal assault against the town of Saint-Vith. The unit was driven out of the town 2 weeks ago when the Nazis mounted their last-ditch offensive in the Ardennes. Now, as the pendulum of war swings back in favor of the Allies, they are taking it back from SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army. Supported by elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the tankers roll into the town after a devastating artillery barrage. From the rubble, the remaining Germans offer a desperate counterattack. They fight like cornered beasts, inflicting heavy casualties upon the Americans. But unlike last month, the U.S. Army is the juggernaut now, and within hours, every last Nazi soldier in Saint-Vith is either dead or marched into captivity. Meanwhile, in a frantic fight for the villages of La Glaise and Monhaix, SS Colonel Joachim Piper's 1st SS Panzer Division has its first encounter with the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, known as Roosevelt's SS, for the ruthless manner in which it fights. All too soon, the arrogant Piper learns that the reputation is well-deserved. The Americans inflict grievous casualties upon his unit. Piper watches helplessly as his supplies of fuel and ordnance expire at the height of the battle. Abandoning its heavy Tiger tanks and other equipment, Kampfgruppe Piper flees back to Germany on foot. In the south, the ever-successful General George Patton commits his 5th Infantry Division to the fray, making a surprise crossing of the Sour River toward the town of Diekirch, Luxembourg. With their flank protected by the 4th Infantry Division, the veteran 5th soon begins pushing the enemy back. Again, the Germans, unable to get fuel and artillery rounds, cannot mount an effective defense against the steamrollering Americans. As the Americans re-establish their forward lines, 9 divisions of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army near Bastogne and 4 divisions of General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army in the south are forced to fall back towards the German frontier. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army is pulled from the front and sent east to stem the Russian advance. As dawn approaches on 28 January, Allied officials declare the Battle of the Bulge to be officially over. Not so the Battle of the Generals. The ever-sanctimonious British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proudly steps up to press microphones and declares that he has saved the proverbial American skin in the Ardennes. American generals, noting that he had never actually committed more than 1 British brigade to the fracas, are outraged. To make matters worse, Monty reiterates his suggestion that he be placed in command of all ground forces in the European theater. Montgomery has gone too far, Ike declares. It is time for one of them to go. Montgomery's chief of staff, catching wind of the situation, convinces his boss to retract the request, as clearly America is now the force behind the Allied war effort. A pouting and petulant Montgomery insists he meant no harm. Ultimately, it falls to no less a personage than Winston Churchill to smooth over the Americans' ruffled feathers. Outraged at Montgomery's stupidity, he declares from the floor of the House of Commons that the Battle of the Bulge is an American victory, destined to live forever in the history books. Evidence of this epic victory lies strewn about the Ardennes. The forest floor is littered with the corpses of more than 100,000 men of the Führer's Wehrmacht. In a fruitless attempt to split the Allies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace, Hitler has exhausted his troop reserves in the Stygian dark of this ancient wood. Their armies shattered, the Germans have been pushed back to the West Wall in just over a month. But the reversal has been hard won. Just 6 weeks ago, American soldiers talked happily under these trees of a white Christmas in the States. Now their frozen bodies are stacked like cordwood, waiting to be counted and sent to graves registration for burial. More than 81,000 sons of American mothers have paid the ultimate price to defend a piece of woods most had never even heard of, all because of one madman's desperate desire for self-preservation. January 1945, Myitkyina. In the mountains and jungles of North Burma, the engineering ordeal known as the Ledo Road is now complete. A crucial link from British-held India to the Burma Road, the 500-mile route is the only viable overland supply artery to the Chinese nationalists. This stretch of gravel has come at a terrible cost in human lives, both for the workers who blasted through rock to build it and the soldiers who blasted the Japanese out of the jungles. It has been said that the Ledo Road was laid down at the rate of a mile a day and cost a man a mile. But the mortality rate alone doesn't begin to describe their ordeal. A dark cloud of malaria, typhus, and other tropical diseases followed the caravan as it snaked through the godforsaken Burmese countryside. When the monsoons came, dumping up to 15 inches of rain a day, the jungles became infested with all manner of repulsive fauna, including omnipresent purple leeches. Soldiers slept in wet tents, worked in wet clothes, and slogged through wet earth without relief. If conditions became more than the workers could bear, Japanese snipers and fighter pilots were more than happy to put them out of their misery. Over 80% of the road was built over contested ground. As the engineers labored, Chinese and American troops fanned out ahead of them, beating the bushes for Japanese troops. Even as the first supply trucks pulled out of Ledo in late December, Chinese soldiers were desperately clearing the way. A convoy led by General Louis Pick slowly pushed off over the foreboding terrain bound for Kunming, China, some 1,100 miles away. Steep grades slowed the group to a crawl, extending the trip into a month-long odyssey of fits and starts. Defying the equally steep odds they had been given in 1943 for completing a usable road, the convoy arrives intact. All the fighting in North Burma has led to this moment. Cut off since 1941 when the Japanese severed the Burma Road, Chinese troops under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek have been holding on by their fingernails. The Allies now hope that an adequately supplied nationalist army will draw Japan's battered war machine away from fighting in the Pacific. The Ledo Road also means fewer deadly airlifts over the hump of the Himalayas. Generalissimo Chiang, presumably without irony, renames the Ledo to Kunming route the Stilwell Road shortly after it is opened. General Joseph Stilwell had been Chiang's chief of staff in the China-Burma-India theater until he was stripped of command for his lack of deference to the Asian leader. The imperative now is to wipe the hills and jungles clean of the enemy, free more troops for the conflict in China, and finally sweep the Japanese from the mainland. As part of Operation Capital, General Daniel Sultan, Stilwell's successor, launches an attempt to secure the Burma Road from the north and drive east to west toward Lashio. Witnessing a large supply drop to the American Mars Task Force, the Japanese mistakenly think they are under attack by paratroopers. Their misunderstanding is perhaps justified, as the Marsmen are part of a continuing Allied experiment in long-range penetration warfare. Starting with the British Chindits and the American Galahad Task Force, also known as Merrill's Marauders, the Allies have been deploying forces deep into Burma for some time, substituting air attacks and supply drops for traditional artillery support and supply lines. The results have been mixed, but encouraging enough to give it another go with the Mars Task Force. Equipped with few heavy weapons and driven by mule power, the Marsmen's task is to act as a catalyst for the larger Chinese forces in the area. The Chinese nationalists have often failed to fulfill their strategic responsibilities in Burma. Simple orders do not suffice for Chiang's forces, which are little more than a crazy quilt of smaller warlord armies. They need to be poked and prodded into action, often on the pretext of preserving their own honor. Sultan's hope is that successful American attacks on the Japanese 56th Division will force the Chinese to save face and commit 2 nearby divisions of their own to the fray. Believing they are under a large-scale airborne invasion, the Japanese retreat down the Burma Road and are continually harassed by Mars mortars and demolition teams. Unfortunately, the Chinese failed to finish off the Japanese troops, later claiming they expected the Marsmen to block the road completely. The first week of February is characterized by furious fighting as the Japanese division beats a hasty southern retreat, stopping often to buy time with short, furious counterattacks. Enemy artillery barrages are met with Allied air raids. Soon the Mars Task Force faces only minor skirmishes with the tail end of the departing Japanese forces. When the Chinese finally link up with the Americans at the Burma Road, the enemy has retired well to the south. But the failure to destroy the enemy cannot overshadow the stunning accomplishment of reopening the land route to China. Now that supplies can flow freely into the theater, the sun is beginning to set on the Emperor's Chinese adventure. Look closely. Those aren't GIs in training, they're nurses. Some of the more than 75,000 women who serve in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. Although both service organizations were established in the first decade of this century, it has been only in the last 3 years that they have matured into indispensable professional service corps. Medics remove wounded troops from the battlefield and take them to field evacuation hospitals. Using a new technique called triage, doctors and nurses determine who can wait for treatment and who cannot. They diagnose the extent of a soldier's wound and prioritize it according to a common schedule of levels of required care. Men who are unstable or critically wounded receive immediate treatment. Those who can withstand travel are relocated to evacuation hospitals just a few miles away. From evacuation hospitals, men may be transported to station hospitals even further from the front, and from there to semi-permanent general hospitals. Today, the time between the battlefield and treatment is usually a matter of hours rather than days. Quick treatment, new drugs, and highly skilled medical personnel make the difference between this and past wars, and between life and death. Nurses provide an important link in the medical evacuation chain. They bear the brunt of the responsibility for setting up and maintaining the various hospitals along the way. They scrub and disinfect walls and floors in vacant buildings they must turn into hospitals. They pack and unpack hospital tents and procure medical supplies, scavenging if they have to. But they do more. They are not menial laborers. Whether they serve at the front, on hospital trains or ships, or at more permanent hospitals away from the fighting, they assist doctors in surgery, administer anesthesia, give blood transfusions, provide physical therapy, and treat the emotionally injured. Evacuation flights that whisk the wounded from one facility to another often carry only one nurse. These Florence Nightingales of the air, with only one medical corpsman to share the duty, can be charged with the safety and comfort of as many as 25 patients. And they do so under a greater threat of enemy fire than their peers at the front. Since the transport planes that evacuate the wounded also double as cargo planes, they are not protected from enemy fire under the Geneva Convention. Who is today's military nurse? She is patriotic, duty-bound, and adventuresome. She is a highly skilled medical professional, able to treat injury and trauma unlike any she would have encountered in peacetime, and deal with such exotic and unfamiliar diseases as malaria, dysentery, and trench foot. Nurses distinguished themselves at Pearl Harbor on that horrible day of infamy, and on Bataan when the Japanese marched in and took prisoners. They landed in North Africa with the Allied invasion force, distinguishable from their brothers in arms only by their Red Cross armbands and their lack of weapons. When the enemy doesn't acknowledge the neutrality that a Red Cross signifies, nurses pay the price. Nurses have lived and worked under rugged, dangerous, and frightening conditions for more than 3 years. They have sustained enemy shelling and bombing, dug foxholes and taken shelter in them, and been trapped for months behind enemy lines. Some are spending the war in enemy prison camps. Others have died in the line of duty. Are they weary of battle? Yes, but they won't tell you they are. For despite the inherent danger in their jobs, their responsibility to their patients, the battle casualties of this war, the sick and the injured, always comes first. January 1945, Pomerania. As the Russian war machine pounds across Poland like a steel-clad hydra, the woefully outnumbered German forces lose ground at an alarming rate. Stalin's tanks advance on 4 separate fronts, and the once fearsome Wehrmacht scrambles to avoid annihilation. This series of withdrawals and defeats infuriates Hitler, who responds by stripping officers of their medals, their commands, and, in some cases, their freedom. Generals with the common sense to order a retreat find themselves behind bars. The less fortunate officers, those still in command, must now clear every decision with Berlin. Soon, frontline commanders are in a state of desperation as the Second Byelorussian Front, led by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, smashes the German Second Army, kicking open the door to the heart of the fatherland. It's obvious to Hitler's beleaguered Chief of Staff, General Heinz Guderian, that the hole must be plugged. At Guderian's urging, Hitler creates Army Group Vistula to guard the German frontier in Pomerania and buttress the decimated Army Group A. What this critical command requires is a wily, battle-hardened officer. What it gets is Bavarian chicken farmer Heinrich Himmler, who has already proven himself incompetent as the commander of Western Front forces on the Upper Rhine. Frustrated with the practicality of his career officers, Hitler now hopes a Nazi true believer will gleefully drive his troops into the Soviet meat grinder. It is perhaps appropriate that Himmler should command the group, as it is largely composed of the shoddy Volkssturm units he helped to create. The Volkssturm represent the last desperate scrapings of the Wehrmacht's manpower reserves. They are young boys and old men with little training and scrounged weaponry. Himmler's initial moves include evacuating strategic outposts along the rivers and attacking an empty town. Undaunted by the foul-ups, Hitler decides to launch Operation Solstice, an assault on Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces from Himmler's northern position. Of course, the Fuhrer wants his longtime Nazi compatriot to lead the drive, but wiser heads prevail. Guderian positions the seasoned General Walter Wenck as commander by proxy of the operation. Meanwhile, Himmler checks himself into a sanitarium but maintains nominal control over his troops. Solstice is a doomed venture, regardless of who leads it. The counterattack is confounded from the start by impassable roads, sparse air support, and dwindling supplies. To make matters worse, General Wenck is seriously injured while driving to the front, forcing Himmler from his bed and back to the front. The return of Hitler's hand-picked semi-invalid speeds the demise of the army group. For the Russians, Operation Solstice amounts to little more than a speed bump on the road to Berlin. The Red Army continues to move as fast as its supply line will allow, streaking across the Polish countryside to the German frontier. In short measure, the troops of Zhukov's First Byelorussian Front reach the Oder River at Zayden. Although other Soviet units have reached the Oder at several places along its length, gaining Zayden has special implications. Here, the Soviets are less than 50 miles from Berlin and Hitler's lair. In the south, where the Oder bends toward the east, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front has broken out of their bridgeheads on the Vistula and made spectacular gains. As with General Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery in the west, intense rivalry also exists among the Russian commanders. Although Zhukov has the most direct line of advance to the German capital, his bridgeheads and supply lines are both tenuous. Additionally, he can expect the bulk of the German defenses in his path. Konev knows this. Although he too will suffer from supply problems, he also knows that the Nysa River sector assigned to him affords a much better opportunity for both fording and maneuver. Thus, he spurs his command forward, encircling the Silesian capital of Breslau. The capture of Berlin is the final glory in a war already won. Konev's strategy is to cross the Nysa, roll up the German flank, and drive for Berlin, ahead of Zhukov. But Konev meets stiff opposition both from the German defenders in his path and from the Soviet High Command. He is forced to halt his drive on the Nysa, pull even with Zhukov, and mop up the bypassed Germans. Neither potential conqueror of Berlin will start with an unfair advantage. Despite the retrograde actions of commanders and the heroics of individual soldiers, the overwhelming tide of Soviet men and materiel simply crush any attempt at organized resistance. The 70 divisions destroyed in whole or part represent the latest sacrifice on the altar of Hitler's fanaticism. The forces of outraged humanity are closing vice-like on the lair of mankind's greatest evil. The instrument of Hitler's reckoning lies less than an hour's Autobahn drive away, to the east. February 1945, Dresden. For generations, this quiet city of church spires and cobbled streets has been known for its china, its art masterpieces, and its architecture. With little industry and no troop concentrations, it has been spared the devastating consequences of Adolf Hitler's doomed bid for world domination, while the terrible force of the Allies' strategic bombing campaign has turned most of Germany's cities into rubble. With the war now all but over, there is no reason to believe enemy bombers will strike at Dresden, and that has made it a mecca for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Red Army offensives in Prussia to the north and Silesia to the east. Soviet troops are now only 80 miles away, and the city's population has mushroomed from 680,000 to well over 1 million. Housing and other facilities are strained, but residents and refugees alike are thankful to be living in what they believe is an open city. Civil defense measures common in other cities long have been neglected here. No huge concrete and steel public air raid bunkers have been built. There are very few alternate sources of water and electrical power. Many of the existing bomb shelters are not properly ventilated. Few residents know what to do in the event of an attack. As the people of Dresden settle in for the night, British Lancaster bombers loaded with a combination of high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices are headed their way. Their mission, codenamed Thunderclap, is the carpet bombing of Dresden. It is designed to achieve maximum destruction of the city's interior on a scale so far unseen in this or any war. The master bomber responsible for overseeing the operation reaches Dresden at about 10 p.m. ahead of the air armada. He will stay over the target throughout the raid, directing successive bomb runs. He is joined soon by the marker planes, which drop flares to highlight the stadium that will be the center of the target area. Anxiously, they watch for Nazi fighters or flak, but the night skies over Dresden are clear. Satisfied that Dresden is completely undefended, the master bomber orders his pilots to approach the city below the cloud cover. As they make their runs, there is nothing to stop or even distract them. Their bombs find their targets with impressive accuracy. In Dresden, the high explosive bombs create mountains of debris, fuel for the incendiary devices that follow. The shock waves knock out windows and smash roofs. Sparks from the first fires blow into other buildings, igniting anything flammable. One by one, the many smaller fires begin to come together in a single, horrific conflagration. German firefighters wage a desperate battle as air raid sirens signal the approach of a second wave of 529 bombers. As they approach, the second group of British airmen sees a brilliant scarlet and white glow in the sky. Visible from miles away, the fiery aura of the burning city guides the planes directly to Dresden. One airman estimates that sea of fire covers 40 square miles. Another is reminded of the warnings of evangelists in gospel meetings. For those on the ground, it must now seem that hell is opened to swallow them. Smoke blankets the area. Sparks are flying everywhere. The clothes of those fleeing start to smolder, then ignite. People are sucked, screaming, into the flames. Others simply fall noiselessly to the ground as they run, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning. Even the city's air raid shelters offer no refuge from the inferno. Many are inadequate and poorly ventilated. The heat, which approaches 1,000 degrees centigrade, turns some into ovens, literally baking those inside. Dawn on Ash Wednesday finds fires still burning in many areas as Dresden's devastated survivors pick their way through a desolate moonscape. But there is yet another chapter in Dresden's tale of horror. Just past noon, a third wave of more than 1,300 American B-17s and Liberator bombers appears. Dropping thousands of bombs through the obscuring smoke, they pulverize what is left of the tortured city. Finally, there is quiet, and those left alive begin digging for the dead. In 14 hours, more than 2,300 Allied planes have dropped 4,700 tons of bombs on Dresden, including 600,000 incendiary devices. 3,000 acres in the center of Dresden are completely leveled. The death toll from this bombing raid is the largest of any in the war. Some estimates run as high as 130,000, almost all of them civilians. This would be more than double the number of British civilians killed in German air raids in the war to date. And still, the question lingers, why? Why this raid against this target at this time? It was well known that the city was brimful of civilian refugees, and that at least 26,000 Allied prisoners of war were held there. As Dresden was of little strategic importance to the Reich, it is possible this raid had less to do with the outcome of the war than with what will come after. Perhaps it was a message to the huge and powerful Red Army, a message that the Americans and the British still have great power of their own. For February 1945, Manila. Allied forces are taking a crash course in urban warfare as elements of the 6th and 8th Armies move in to encircle the city. During December and January, Japan strengthened its defenses in Manila with some 4,000 new troops, turning the city and its environs into a veritable stockade. Building entrances have been entrenched with sandbags, tunnels have been dug between the basements of buildings, and streets have been blocked with barbed wire. Hastily adapting from jungle fighting to street fighting, American GIs forced their way into the city and free 3,700 American prisoners at Santo Tomas University. Beneath bursts of vicious machine gun fire, Americans stormed the old Bilibad prison, liberating hundreds of Allied prisoners of war and more than 500 civilians. Other American units begin clearing Japanese resistance from residential areas of the city in a bloody struggle that reduces entire urban blocks to piles of smoking rubble. Despite orders from General Tomoyuki Yamashita declaring Manila an open city, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi vows to defend the city to the death. Disorder and lawlessness spread like a contagion from the top down, as Filipino citizens suffer the brutality of Japanese troops enraged by imminent defeat. On 5 February, the Japanese blow up supplies and operations in Manila's North Port area. In an effort to keep the flames from spreading to the city's residential areas, American troops spent nearly a full day destroying frame buildings in the path of the fire. Anticipating that the Japanese planned similar demolitions to Manila's utility systems, other U.S. units scrambled to secure the city's water supply facilities and electrical power installations. Now, the going is slow and treacherous for the airborne troops of the 11th Corps as they move northward into Manila and begin rooting out the enemy house by house and pillbox by pillbox. These maneuvers add to the city's devastation as mortar shells and demolitions blast through the walls of once peaceful homes and businesses. Flamethrowers transform neighborhoods into hellish infernos. Burning Japanese soldiers run screaming from the wildly shifting vortices of fire and death. As the 1st Cavalry presses forward to capture water supply facilities on the outskirts of the city, they stumble into another messy street battle. The Japanese have heavily mined the streets within New Manila and turned many homes into machine gun nests. The minefields halt the advance of American tanks and render them useless, leaving soldiers to rush recklessly from one strong point to another to gain ground. Troops clean out the rest of the suburban area northeast and east of the city during the next few days, claiming 350 Japanese casualties and a sizable cache of weapons. As the battle in Manila rages, the Japanese still hold tight to Nichols Field and the Cavite Naval Base. An American attack on the airfield is almost aborted after a withering encounter with artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire from Japanese defenses. But on 10 February, Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold takes control of the 11th Airborne and secures the southeast corner and the southern runway of Nichols Field. After a Marine airstrike knocks out many Japanese artillery positions, Griswold's airborne troops overrun most of the field and finish mopping up the next day. On 12 February, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division advanced to the shores of Manila Bay to complete the Allied encirclement of the city and its Japanese defenders. General Yamashita's troops, now isolated in the surrounding mountains, can choose only between surrender and a fight to the death. February 1945, Reichswald Forest. Just before dawn, the German 84th Division gets the worst kind of wake-up call, a 1,400-gun salute from Canadian artillery. They wake up in time to die. General Henry Crayar's big guns set the stage for Operation Veritable, the first step in the final Allied push to the Rhine. The British Second Army and the Canadian First Army position themselves to swoop down on Wesel from the northwest, hoping to link up at the Rhine with the U.S. Ninth Army. For the plan to work, the Allies have to gain control of downstream dams on the Ruhr River, which the Germans used to flood the valley. General Omar Bradley had dispatched the U.S. First Army to capture the dams and close the floodgates. After several days of fighting, Bradley's forces wrested control of the dams from enemy hands, but discovered the Germans had sabotaged the spillways. South of the Ruhr, The Ninth Army had been set to launch Operation Grenade simultaneously with Veritable, but that is now a logistical impossibility. The valley remains an impassable mud pit, and the Ruhr is too high to bridge. The GIs are forced to sit and wait. To the north, however, the die has been cast. The combined forces of Veritable have blasted a hole in the German 84th, allowing Allied infantrymen to plow forward. Ahead of them lies the dense reaches of Reichswald Forest, with its countless landmines, sloppy ground, and desperate German defenders. The Allies weren't expecting Hansel and Gretel, but they are surprised by the ferocity of German resistance. The enemy is no longer fighting for Aryan living space, but for his own backyard. For their part, German commanders were not expecting Monty's forces to attack over such daunting terrain. General Alfred Schlemm is the exception. His unit of paratroopers throws everything it has into the battle, taking advantage of deployment missteps by the newly integrated Veritable forces. Because the Ninth Army is bogged down in the muck, the German High Command can divert a healthy share of its scant resources to repel the British and Canadians. One by one, Schlemm moves supplemental forces into Reichswald, bitterly contesting every inch of territory. The tiny villages that dot the forest become fortresses for crack divisions of paratroopers. Despite the suffering of his Veritable forces, the redeployment of Nazi troops is encouraging to Montgomery. As Germany's finest meet the northern attack, the Americans are waiting impatiently on the banks of the Ruhr, sharpening their bayonets. The Nazis have turned their backs on these GIs and on the slowly receding river holding them at bay. Now, Montgomery is ready to pull the pin on Operation Grenade. February 1945. After 10 days of peace talks, Greece finally seals the lid on its savage civil war between communist guerrillas and the loyal monarchists who are supported by 50,000 British soldiers. Though the Nazis pulled out in October 1944, the country has remained awash in strife for nearly 4 months. Greece's dauntless communist guerrillas, instrumental in the campaign against the Nazis, were devastated when their long-awaited liberation came not from the armies of the communist Soviet Union, but from the imperialistic-minded British. Throughout the European theater, communist citizens have played a disproportionately large role in guerrilla campaigns against the Nazis. From Belgium to Yugoslavia, these ragtag shadow armies have been instrumental in disrupting and distracting the German war machine. Unwilling to bow to their Axis conquerors, normal citizens have formed pockets of resistance. They have fled the cities and found refuge in mountains and forests. Hopelessly outnumbered, they cannot engage their enemy in traditional face-to-face confrontation. Instead, they have waged campaigns of guerrilla warfare, sabotaging rail lines, destroying communications, and ambushing patrols. These men and women patriots may be without uniforms, but they are soldiers nonetheless. Just 11 days after the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia, the government fled and an armistice was signed. The invasion cost only 151 German lives. The low number of casualties and a similarly rapid, low-cost occupation of Greece left Adolf Hitler anything but impressed by the Balkan fighting spirit. In preparation for his invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler pulled the majority of his troops from Yugoslavia, leaving behind only 4 battle-weary divisions. Der Führer's analysis of the resolve of the Balkan people would prove to be a gross underestimation. Had he studied but a little of the area's history, Hitler would have learned that the question was not if the Balkan people would resist, but rather when. Action began immediately after the German pullout. Using the naturally rugged terrain to their advantage, the fiercely patriotic guerrillas carefully picked their battlegrounds and initiated small skirmishes, bringing combat to a more personal level than panzers and artillery normally allow. Out of this ragtag army, a leader emerges, Josef Broz, known as Tito. Devoted to communism and Mother Russia, Tito is determined to do all he can to ease the strain on the Soviets in the Eastern Front. His highly aggressive and daring army of partisans, named after the bands of Spanish guerrillas who fought Napoleon, engaged in textbook shadow warfare. They laid their ambushes at mountain passes and coastal roadways, striking quickly and retreating into the landscape. To the Germans, they were everywhere and nowhere at once. Just 5 months after Hitler had withdrawn from Yugoslavia, Tito realized his objective. German reinforcements were called back, including a full division from the Russian front. The Nazis slammed the rebels with everything they had, overpowering the partisans with armor, artillery, and air power. Tito quickly called for a retreat, and his army vanished into the mountainous Sandjak region on the Serbian border, where the German heavy weapons couldn't follow. Failing time and again to find a final solution to the Yugoslavian problem, Hitler launched 7 separate operations, each larger than the previous, each with more men, machines, and supplies which were desperately needed in other arenas. But Yugoslavia was too large for the Nazis to be everywhere at once, and the geography worked against them. There was always somewhere for Tito and his men to hide. In October 1944, an enraged and frustrated Hitler had 14 divisions and more than 140,000 men bogged down in an enervating occupation of Yugoslavia, when Tito, acting as president and as marshal of an 800,000-man partisan army, returned to Belgrade with the support of the Soviets and drove the Germans from the city. In Greece, a group of communist partisans known as Elos also attracted the attention of the Allies. The Brits, though wary of supporting the radical communists, still gave their assistance. Elos was killing the most Nazis. The group would eventually control more than 50% of Greece. In 1943, an attempt to trick the Germans into believing an invasion of Greece was imminent, 3 weeks of massive guerrilla activity was mounted. The objective was to keep the German High Command ignorant of the real Allied invasion point, Sicily. While Allied commanders considered the operation an overwhelming success, the guerrillas, never told the true purpose of their missions, were upset that no Allied landing force ever arrived. Nevertheless, the call for uprising was heard by citizens all over occupied Europe, and as the eventual arrival of an Allied Liberation Army became more and more imminent, the guerrillas' numbers rose. In France, the well-organized Maquis helped prepare for the massive Normandy invasion and actually kept 2 German divisions from the beaches. Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Italy each also produced its own unique guerrilla movement. It is difficult to measure the impact of the guerrillas. While no credit for the tide of Allied victory can be usurped from the men in uniform, there is no doubt that the guerrillas have played an important strategic role. Their constant harassment and sabotage have placed an incalculable burden on the Germans, delaying the arrival of supplies, disrupting communication, demanding the attention of armed forces, and diverting complete concentration on the invading troops. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis now know that defeating an army is one thing. Defeating a nation is quite another.